Well, hello, and welcome back to another reading of Inside Mind of BTK. We have three long chapters to go before the book is finished. So I decided to come back with this reading. That way I can only focus on A Serial Killer's Daughter by BTK's daughter, Kerry Rawson, on the other Madam with Bass channel. But for now, I'd like you to listen to one of my favorites while I go ahead and do something. Enjoy. I'll be back shortly.
We started out the same frame. That kind of friendship never ends. No, baby. But we were fortunate to carry on. We knew just where we stood. But soon as love appeared, you turned away, and you were so unsure and so afraid of feeling what I was feeling. You were scared that love would blow your heart away, and you were certain that in time our love would stray. So where will you go? And who's gonna love you like I do? Where will you go? And who's gonna love you like I do? What kind of friends could we have been? Yeah. If we had kept feeling when we had made a vow to be the friends we were since we began. But soon as love appeared, you turned away, and you were so unsure, so afraid of feeling what I was feeling. You were scared that love would blow your heart away, and you were certain that in time I love you were thinking now love was gonna stay. Oh, tell me where will you go? Tell me who's gonna love you, baby? Way that I could not, baby. Where will you go? Where will you go? Tell me who is gonna love? I wanna know who is gonna love. I need to know who's gonna love, who's gonna love, where will you go, baby? Who's gonna love you, baby? Tell me. Who's gonna care for you, baby? Who's gonna be there for you, baby? Who's gonna love and who's gonna love you like I do? Ooh,
Who gonna love you like Madam
baby.
Whip Rap?
Ooh,
All this wickedness going on out here, desecrating graves and things. Who gonna love you like Madam Whip Rap? Nobody. That's who. Come on, baby face. All right. That was Babyface. Where will you go? All right, let's get to it. Chapter 22. A few hours later, I woke, showered, and pulled on a pair of trousers, a sport coat over my tan plaid shirt, and loafers. On the way out of my room, I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. Jesus, I laughed. You look just like a prison shrink. Even though Raider knew my background, I discovered years ago that wearing casual clothes helped grease the skids during these prison interviews. Incarcerated felons, it seems, can smell a cop 200 feet away. Dressing down gave me the appearance of being either a social worker or a member of the prison psych staff, two categories that tended to put inmates at ease. I grabbed my briefcase and headed down to the lobby for a cup of coffee, then took a seat at a rickety table. Tucked away in my briefcase was a folder containing 5 pieces of yellow paper yanked from a legal pad. The pages were a gift from Caserona, handed to me the previous night. Rada had mailed them to her a few days earlier. Turned out that when he learned I was writing a book about him and that Chris had given him her blessing to speak with me, Rada decided to contribute an essay of sorts. As Landwehr had told me during my last visit to Wichita, Rada was a fan of my books. Predictably, his favorite was Obsession, no doubt because the first chapter was a thinly veiled account of the BTK case. According to Caserona, Rada was impressed at what I seemed to know about him long before police apprehended him. Over the years, he had gone back to that chapter again and again. He had told Chris that reading what I'd written gave him a sense of perspective about himself he never had. Oh, he told he had told Chris that reading what I'd written gave him a sense of perspective about him he'd never had, allowing him to better understand the forces that writhed and squirmed within him, compelling him to kill. Not that this insight did him a lick of good, but because he could never turn to a psychiatrist or a psychologist for help, what I'd written in Obsession felt as close to a therapy session as he'd ever had. The words on the pages of that chapter forced him to ask questions about himself. Of course, he never figured out any answers, but as I've said before, for someone as shallow and empty as Raider, just asking the questions was good enough. I spread Raider's essay out across the table. I'd never had a serial killer send me a piece of writing quite like this before. Neither had any of my colleagues. At first glance, the pages looked to be nothing more than scribbled notes culled from that first chapter of Obsession. Raider's words were printed in black ink in the same tiny, hopeless chicken scratch employed in his journals. I'm no handwriting specialist, but his contained tight lettering reminded me of just how controlled and withdrawn Raider was. His scrawl looked hollow, flat in a way I'd never seen before when reading the handwritten words of a killer. It was almost as though Raider had been attempting to write something else, but this came out instead, and it made me feel as though I were peering into his brain. He intended this document to be a type of chart. Across the top of the first page, he'd written the words obsession, case studies. Down the middle of the page, he printed out a list of qualities and attributes that I discussed in the book as ones he shared with other serial killers, all of which he must have felt were relevant to him. On the left side of the yellow paper, he referenced the page number and paragraphs where these traits had been described in obsession. The words appeared on the page in quick bursts, jumping from one disturbing topic to the next, never remaining in one place for very long. Manipulation, domination, control, locate and identify, profile victim, knows how to get inside victim's head, manipulation, domination, control of that victim. He can and does the same to law enforcement. Background of virtually all of them, serial killers, came from abusive or otherwise severely dysfunctional background, but that doesn't excuse what they do. Compelled to commit violent predatory crime, sexual predators and child molesters do enjoy their crimes. Signature aspect, better than MO. MO is what an offender has to do to accomplish a crime. The signature, on the other hand, is what the offender has to do to fulfill himself emotionally. It's not needed to successfully accomplish the crime, but it is the reason he undertakes the particular crime in the first place. Predator, in the night and always on the hunt for a victim of opportunity. Voyeurism, which would be consistent with hunting, getting ready for next assault. Graphic comfort. The sadistic killer anticipates his crime. In fact, he has perfected his MO over his criminal career. Fantasy evolves and he gains more experience. Bring weapon, torture kit, whip, manacles, etc. Place to take his victim, not disturbed. Obscure cabin in the woods outfitted with soundproof. Uses ruse. May take photographs or record the scenes. Take souvenirs, jewelry, underwear. Most often ends in murder. Killing the victim may be the integral part of the sadistic fantasy scenario. Sadistic type, white, above normal intelligence, may be college educated with good middle class job. He will have a dominant personality and collect bondage and sadomasochist bondage. He may collect related items such as knives, guns, read military, read military, law enforcement, or survivalist literature. He may have a large attack type dog. Because of his intelligence and planning, he will be difficult to apprehend. On each of the next 4 pages, he created another type of chart, comparing himself with other serial killers, the ones with whom he yearned to share equal billing. This was another example of Rader's bloated ego at work. His murders made him somebody, although he seemed to have forgotten that they started out as a secret, something he wanted no one to know about. But the moment he realized how much attention his crimes were receiving from the media, he reveled in the notoriety. Suddenly, he wanted the world to know that the BTK Strangler was badder than bad and utterly unstoppable. The same thing happened to David Berkowitz, Ted Kaczynski, and the Zodiac Killer. This last case ranks as one of the nation's major unsolved serial murder cases. The rush created by seeing and hearing his name in the media gave Rader a far better buzz than the one he received from actually killing another human being. Across the top of the pages, he listed the names Ted Bundy, Son of Sam, Ed Kemper, Stephen Pennell, Delaware's first serial killer, a case I was called in to work due to my expertise in the field of torture, the fictional killer Buffalo Bill from the movie Silence of the Lambs, and Gary Heidnik, a serial killer from Philadelphia, who kept women in his cellar in a pit filled with water and electrocuted them. Rader also included a column for BTK. Extending down the left side of the page, he listed a smorgasbord of biographical and psychological traits, then answered yes or no beside each killer's name, depending on whether or not they possessed that specific quality. I found it interesting that beside the entry for overbearing mother, he scrawled half, like the half mathematical sign, 1/2. I assumed that this meant she was only half overbearing and made a note to ask himself about this if I got the chance during our interview. Next to the entries for arrogance, self centered, and inside voices, he wrote no. Yet, when he pondered the question of whether or not he was intelligent, he decided that the answer was yes. In fact, he concluded that each of the serial killers on his chart, with the exception of Berkowitz and the fictional Buffalo Bill, both of whom he wasn't sure about, also possessed what he considered to be intelligence. In a note above the final page of his chart, he wrote, Key, predator don't care what happens to victims as long as he gets what he wants. These words were perhaps the most honest Rader had ever written, cutting straight to the heart of who he was and what he stood for. I couldn't imagine a better epitaph for this heartless killer. It was just after 8 a.m. when I climbed into my rental car to begin the drive to El Dorado, steering north on I-135 past Park City, past the off-ramp that Rader took to get to his house. It was green and lush this time of year in Kansas. In 2 short months, most of these fields would be baked golden brown by the fierce Kansas sun. It was Sunday morning. Every cemetery I drove past had American flags fluttering in the warm morning breeze. Since Rader's transfer to this state facility following his sentencing in August of 2005, the only family member to visit him was his youngest brother, Paul, the same one Dennis used to defend, the same one Dennis used to defend in grade school when the other kids would torment him because of his size. Paul brought their mother with him, but she was so hopelessly lost in the fog of Alzheimer's that she couldn't grasp what her oldest son had done and why he'd been locked away in prison. From what my source told me, the two brothers cried when they saw each other, and the bulk of the visit revolved around Paul telling Dennis what his relatives had been doing since his arrest. Neither his wife, Paula, her parents, nor any of his children had visited Rader. Kerry sent him a few letters at first, but hadn't written in over a year. Paula has never communicated with her now former husband since he's been at El Dorado. But Dennis told my source that his dreams about the day she finally does. I'll read that again. But Dennis told my source that he dreams about the day she finally does. Well, it's been 18 years, nigga. She ain't even thinking about you. Or any man for that matter. I think she's had enough. She probably doesn't trust herself. Think about it. I don't know how old each and every one of you are who are listening, but at any age, let's say you're in your 20s and you've been married and you're married. Let's say, like, after maybe 3 or 4 years of marriage, you find out your husband is a serial killer. Your husband's BTK. You in your 20s. Would you ever trust yourself to date again? Think about it. Me? I don't think I would be able to trust. I wouldn't want to date. And if I was in my 20s, it'd be a long time if I would ever date again. And I probably wouldn't. Now, picture if you're in your 50s, close to 60, like Paula Rader, and you've been married to this man for 30 years and you find out he's a serial killer. You definitely, especially at that age, you ain't hardly gonna date nobody again. You just wouldn't trust yourself. I mean, I think something like that affects you, you know, from so many different standpoints. It really, literally just shakes up your whole world. You don't know who you are anymore. I'm only imagining and assuming, and probably rightfully assuming. I wouldn't trust my judgment. And not only in relationships, I imagine it shook her up. She just wasn't sure about herself in anything, even making the simplest of decisions that she's been making all her life. Something like that suddenly makes you quite insecure, I think. I don't know. Tell me in the comments section, what do you think? Would you be able to date again? Would you even want to date again? Do you get what I'm talking about? Where, you just would not trust yourself in your judgment of people? In one of the only letters she penned to him right after his arrest, she told him that she'd have to forgive him one day in order for God to forgive her for her sins. So Raider tells himself he has that going for him. His son, Brian, writes occasionally, telling him about his life in the Navy and filling him in on family matters. In one letter, Brian commented, "You're not right in the head, and people don't understand that." Dear Dad, you're not right in the head, and people don't understand that. Love, Brian. The drive to the prison from Wichita takes roughly 40 minutes, but it felt longer to me. I didn't know what I expected to take away from this interview. Truth is, I'd had a fairly good understanding about what went on inside Rader's head long before I re-immersed myself in this case. But after digging through his journals, talking to his friends, and interviewing the cops who had chased him, I found that Rader had begun to grow blurry again for me, becoming almost mysterious. The sensation was similar to that of driving in a fog bank. As you approach it, you can make out its shape and dimensions, but within seconds of entering it, you grow disoriented and confused. I still had unanswered questions. Could I truthfully say I understood why he'd gone so long between killings? Did I really know how he was able to compartmentalize his life with such absolute precision? Why did he resurface at the age of 59, an age when most serial killers are incarcerated, dead, or smart enough to understand that serial killing isn't a pastime for old men? At last, what could we in law enforcement learn from Rader to help stop other serial killers earlier in their careers? Meanwhile, I was lost. After what seemed like hours spent on the road, I told myself I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. When I spotted an old man in baggy overalls walking across the gravel parking lot of a diner, I pulled over. "You happen to know where a prison is around here?" I asked, leaning out of the window of my car. The old man gave me the once over, trying to figure out if he knew me or if I looked to be from these parts. "What sort of business you got up there?" he asked. But how fucking nosy can you be? Somebody's asking you for directions. What do you mean? What sort of business you got up there? It's none of your fucking business. Just tell me where the fucking prison is. Somebody I've been wanting to talk to for a long time is waiting for me. Well, ain't that just something? He grinned, and then pointed back at the highway in the direction I was already going. Keep going down the road a ways. You can't miss it. I thanked him and continued on my way. A few minutes later, as I crested a hill, the prison complex loomed enormous in the distance, squat, ringed with what appeared to be miles of glistening chain link fence. A bone white water tower resembling a mushroom cloud jutted up into the sky over the facility. The massive compound looked like something out of a sci fi flick, the kind of place where one might expect to find an evil scientist holed up in a laboratory making poison. I turned off the highway and followed the long, meandering road that led to the parking lot. A wind, warm and furious, blew across the prairie out of the south, bending the tiny saplings along the road. I pulled into a space and parked. From the window of my car, I stared at the dozens of cows and sparrows hunched over on the ground, leaning into the gusts, straining to keep from being blown away. A brass clip dangling from a rope on a massive aluminum flagpole by the guard tower clanged out a rhythm, strangely hypnotic, permeating everything. I made my way toward a concrete walkway, trying not to stare at the stern-faced women sitting inside the dozen or so cars and trucks, preening themselves in their rear-view mirrors. The doors of the prison were constructed from thick glass. Because of the wind, I had to tug on them with all my strength in order to coax them to open. Once I was inside, the first thing that caught my eye was a glass case filled with handicrafts made by the residents of El Dorado. On one of the shelves sat a collection of dream catchers made from yarn and sticks for sale. According to the law, various Native American tribes use these as protection against bad dreams. You simply hang one up over your bed and the nightmares get caught in the yarn before reaching your head. I wonder if Raider's daughter had ever resorted to using one of these. When I heard through some sources that she was a cop buff, I'd written her a letter letting her know that I wanted to ask her some questions about her father. I never received a reply. God knows she could use one of these, I told myself. Maybe I'll pick one up for her on the way out and mail it to her. I made my way over to a large counter where a young woman stood. I told her why I'd come, and she handed me several sheets of paper. You gotta fill these out, she said. I took a seat on a wooden bench and went to work on the forms. All around me, visitors were feeding dollar bills into machines mounted on the walls, transforming their cash into tokens that could later be used in the commissary. The room sounded like the slot section of a Las Vegas casino. A few moments after I returned the visitation forms to her. The clerk motioned me back to the counter and pointed at them. She had questions about what I'd written. What's your relationship to the inmate? She asked. Friend, I told her, feeling ridiculous telling someone I was Dennis Rader's friend. What's your occupation? Former FBI agent. She wrote the word investigator in the blank. She wrote the word investigator in the blank, read over the form, then excused herself, disappearing through a door into a back office with several people in it. A moment later, she returned. Seems to be a bit of a problem, she said. Even though I half expected her to say this, I felt my heart begin to pound. Doing my best to look utterly unconcerned, I smiled. She trotted back into her office again, only to reappear 30 seconds later. Actually, there are two problems, she said. I wasn't interested in hearing what either of them might be. I wouldn't be leaving El Dorado without talking to Raider. If he wanted to shut down the interview, so be it. But I'd waited too long, traveled too many miles, and jumped through too many hoops to get here. So I dropped the names of some heavies in the state's law enforcement and Department of Corrections world who had either tried to get me in here themselves or were aware of my intentions to do so. Why don't you give them a call? I suggested, hoping she wouldn't. I have all their numbers. I think they'd be interested to hear about the runaround I'm getting here. She made several more trips in and out of her office. That way, she said, pointing to a metal door in the corner of a room. I opened it, walked through a metal detector, and proceeded down a hallway lined on either side with bullet resistant glass. Compared to Attica or San Quentin, El Dorado hardly felt intimidating. It was a clean, well lit place that gave off just a I'm sorry. It was a clean, well lit place that gave off a just built vibe. It reeked of fresh paint instead of stale urine. And unlike nearly every facility I'd ever visited, it had actually been landscaped. A guard met me at the end and stamped some sort of invisible ink on top of my hand, and I made my way into a room that resembled a community college cafeteria. Men and women sat across from one another at long tables, holding hands, speaking in hushed tones. A few of the men, all dressed in prison issue jeans and blue t shirts, bounced children on their knees. Violent offenders like Raider posed far too great a risk to be allowed the luxury of a face to face meeting with visitors. These guys, I thought to myself, must be the best of the worst. Another clerk standing behind another desk waved to me. After handing her the piece of paper I carried with me, she studied it and announced, "You got 2.5 hours." Her words didn't sit well with the heaviest woman in lycra shorts standing nearby. "Hey, that's not fair," she shouted. "How come I only get 1 hour and he gets 2.5?" I looked into her angry eyes as she gripped the hand of a chubby cheeked toddler in a dirty NASCAR t shirt. "I've been waiting 30 years to get in here and talk to this guy," I told her, and then watched the expression on her face soften. The clerk handed me a key to a locker, directing me to place my sunglasses and wallet inside. Another guard led me to a row of four tiny wooden three-sided cubicles in a far corner of the room, each just wide enough to fit a chair. I took a seat and noticed the two TV screens, stacked one on top of the other, on the table in front of me on a wooden shelf. On top of the monitors was perched a tiny camera with a lens that resembled the barrel of a 12 gauge. The top screen displayed my image, the same one Raider would be seeing. On the lower monitor, I glimpsed a nondescript room painted the color of week old custard. An empty chair sat in the middle of the floor. Dull white light shone in through a steel barred window on a distant wall. I was dying to ask the guard where on the grounds of this massive prison facility the room on my monitor was located, but I decided against it. Everyone in here seemed so paranoid about security that I knew my question would only make them more nervous. The room was empty, so I sat there for several minutes, marveling at how hot and sticky the air felt. Patches of sweat I could feel had begun to seep through my shirt. Minutes passed. Where the hell was Raider? I wondered. A guard walked over and apologized for the delay, explaining that something had gone screwy with the audio feed between the two rooms. Waiting for the guest of dishonor to appear, I thought back to something Caserona had mentioned the night before. Raider's mood had grown dark lately. A few days earlier, one of his violent fellow inmates thought it would be funny to forge Raider's signature on a "do not resuscitate" form. Prison humor, I suppose. Not long afterward, one of the guards showed up at Raider's cell to make sure he had actually signed the form. Raider apparently stood there in the middle of the cell, staring at the piece of paper and reading the legal jargon over and over again, then informed the guard that the signature was bogus. Kind of thought as much, the man told him, and then turned to leave. Wait, Raider said. He walked over to the tiny desk bolted into the wall, grabbed a pen, crossed out the imposter's scrawl, and then wrote his name across the form. Here, he said. Now I signed it. I attempted to hold in my head that image of Raider standing there, reading that document. He was beginning to settle in. The novelty of his new life behind bars was starting to wear off, and that "do not resuscitate" form reminded him that the only way he would ever leave El Dorado, outside of being transferred to another prison, was zipped up in a rubber body bag atop a gurney. 15 minutes later, the screen of the lower monitor showed a door opening. Raider shuffled into the room, led by a guard. His wrists were handcuffed and his legs were shackled in chains. It hit me that Raider was far thinner and more gaunt than I could ever recall seeing him in photographs or on TV. He must have lost a lot of weight since he's been incarcerated. Maybe he didn't like the prison food. Raider dropped down onto the chair and squinted in the direction of the camera. The blank expression on his face told me that the monitors on his end must still be black. He had no idea I was watching him. I moved closer to the screen and observed beads of sweat glistening on his face. And after a few moments, he attempted to wipe away the wetness, but because of the thick steel chain extending upward from his legs to his wrists, he was unable to lift his hands more than an inch or two up from his lap. Instead, he was forced to double over and place his head into his knees in order to rub away the perspiration by sliding his face back and forth across his hands. You'd think that for a guy who loved bondage, he'd be enjoying himself, but the bored scowl on his face certainly didn't give any indication of that. A minute later, the sound of human breathing erupted from the speakers positioned in front of me. Judging by the self-conscious shift in Raider's void demeanor, I could tell that he was now staring at my image on the screen in front of him. "Hello, sir," he said. His use of the word "sir" startled me. It seemed terribly naive and a bit calculated, especially considering that we were both the same age. "Call me John." Raider nodded. "A mutual friend of ours sends her regards," I said. He nodded again, no doubt conjuring up Caserone's image inside his head. "She's a very sweet woman," Raider said. She's been quite helpful to me." "Yes," I told him. wondering if he had already tortured and murdered her in his mind this morning. I'm sure she has. Raider's face went blank again, as though he hadn't heard me, but I continued. There's something I'm supposed to tell you. Um, the line is strong and it is very positive. Raider squinted into the camera, then bent down, twisted his head sideways, and tapped his right ear with his hand. I could still hear his heavy breathing, but I had a hunch he was attempting to tell me that the sound on his end had gone into the fritz. Once again, we stared into each other's image on the screen in front of us, waiting in silence until the audio began working. The moment the sound came back on, his face lit up as if a thought of great importance had just materialized in his mind. Hey, he said, don't you have some sort of a code for me? This was getting more idiotic with each passing moment. Yes, I replied. The line is very strong and it is positive. Raider nodded slowly, letting the words soak in. His mouth hung open slightly, causing him to look almost befuddled. I had a sneaking suspicion that he'd already forgotten what Caserone's damn code was, but decided to wing it. Very good, he said. That's very good about the lion. Weird shit, y'all. Hey. Okay, thank you. True, welcome. All right, we heading on to chapter 23. There's only 25 chapters, but these chapters are long like shit. But I'm going to try and get through it so I can be done with this book. Very good book, I might add. Dennis Rader sat in the black plastic chair, ramrod straight. The dark circles of sweat on his blue t-shirt were growing larger by the minute, around his armpits and beneath his neck. In the past, I'd always paid close attention to the way my interview subjects perspired. It often meant that they'd begun to lose control. But here in El Dorado, all bets were off. The place felt like a goddamn sauna, and I was dying to take my sport coat off, but decided to keep it on. Raider, no doubt, was impressed by my feeling compelled to put on a sport coat for him. Sorry to hear about your mother, Raider said, squinting as he peered into the camera. His words hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. I figured Caserona might have told him about my mother's death 3 months earlier, but I never imagined that he'd bring it up. Something about a serial killer handing out condolences over the death of a loved one just seems ironic. Not only that, he didn't mean it because he couldn't mean it. At least not the way most people do. But he said it anyway because it was one of those things that normal people said to one another. And Dennis Rader had long ago mastered the art of trying to do and say all the things that were expected of normal people. Y'all, I'm going to have to read that again. I don't want you to overlook that. Psychopaths are monsters. They are not human. And I think in the last reading session, I told you I always envision that when the angels, by the direction of God, are preparing us to enter the womb to be born into the world. And this is just my crazy imagination. I just imagine that we are on a conveyor belt, a long conveyor belt, and there are angels on each side of the conveyor belt. Someone's putting in intelligence, another angel is giving us feet, another angel is putting in the heart, Other angels are dealing with personality traits. And sometimes I think the conveyor belt moves a little bit too fast and they weren't able to put in empathy or compassion. And some people just missed it. The angels missed it. They come into the womb and then they're born into the world without any empathy or compassion. They can't feel anything. They're different, very different, as opposed to someone who was put together. The conveyor belt was rolling just at the right speed where each individual was to get all that they were chosen to receive. And so for psychopaths, they can't feel anything. They think about what they should feel like as opposed to genuinely feeling it. They mimic other people. So this is why I just want to read this short passage again so you can understand what is really being expressed here. So you can really get the gist of a psychopath. So Raider says to John Douglas, "Sorry to hear about your mother," squinting as he peered into the camera. His words hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. I figured Caserona might have told him about my mother's death 3 months earlier, but I never imagined that he'd bring it up. Something about a serial killer handing out condolences over the death of a loved one just seemed ironic. Pay attention now. Not only that, he didn't mean it because he couldn't mean it. At least not the way most people do. But he said it anyway because it was one of those things that normal people said to one another. And Dennis Rader had long ago mastered the art of trying to do and say all the things that were expected of normal people. You see? Psychopaths, sociopaths, they say and do things not because they mean it, not because they feel it. They have been mimicking normal people all their lives. They say things because they think that's what they should say, not because they feel it. Thanks, I said. Rada sat there and listened with a pensive, somber look plastered on his face as I continued to speak about my mother's death. He appeared as though he were trying to fathom what I was telling him, but I knew he could not. It was physically and psychologically impossible. And after a few moments, a thin, dull glaze had begun to descend over his eyes. So I decided to steer the conversation back to him. "I had a hell of a time getting in to see you," I told him. "Yeah," he replied. "There were a few people who rather we didn't talk. 2 FBI agents came here a couple of months ago and told me that I didn't need to be speaking to you. They kept telling me, 'Forget about John Douglas. Talk to us.' I think they're jealous of you." "They're not jealous," I told them. "They're just sore. I've butted heads with the FBI a few times since my retirement in cases where I believed they'd made a mistake. The John Benet Ramsey murder was one of them." I spoke slowly, trying not to appear too anxious to talk about his crimes. I wanted to establish myself as a guy who looked at all sides of a case, the kind who wasn't out to please either prosecutors or defense attorneys. I wanted him to know that I would give him a fair shake. Raider peered intently into the camera and nodded his head slowly. "You don't think her parents had something to do with it?" "No, I don't," I told him. "At different times during the investigation, I was brought in by both the defense and the prosecution, but I walked away from that one convinced there was no way the family could have committed that murder. Well, why not? He asked. When a parent kills a child, the body generally doesn't look like that little girl's did, I said. After the murder, they usually attempt to undo the scene and make it appear more comfortable and peaceful for the victim. But John Bonet had been viciously garroted. Duct tape covered her mouth. Her hands were bound over her head. And shortly before she died, her skull was smashed with a blow that would have brought down a 200-pound man. Raider looked bored, fidgety. He begun to slouch just a bit. All this talk about some murder he'd played no part in had begun to annoy him. I could tell. He wanted this to be all about him. Fearful he was on the verge of growing bored because I wasn't properly stroking his ego, I decided to switch gears and compliment him. I told him that I'd always been impressed with his ability to describe his crime scenes with such uncanny precision. Raider appeared happy to play along with me. His face once again took on that serious look. His head rocked up and down, and his back straightened. I remember every detail from every crime, he replied. I remember every detail like most people do their favorite movie, and I play it over and over again inside my head. That's really how it all started back when I was a child. I had these thoughts and images that played out inside my head. The more I thought about them, the stronger they became. And I just got so caught up in them that pretty soon they took me over and I couldn't fight them anymore. I always felt you had to have had a camera in order to remember all that detail, I said. You must have an amazing memory. Raider turned his face away from the camera and stared off at a distant wall in the room where he was sitting. And for all I knew, he was daydreaming. Perhaps he had just imagined wrapping a rope around Casarona's throat. Raider had spent a lifetime doing just that sort of thing, fantasizing not only about murder and torture, but also about being famous, powerful, influential, and superior to everyone. And when he finally returned and once again made eye contact with the camera, he quickly went to work trying to hoodwink me into believing he was a changed man. I'm trying not to think about those thoughts anymore, he said. I'm trying to have more control over my life, trying to stay away from all those fantasies. It's the only way for me now. When I wake up each morning, that's when the fantasies start. That was when they were always the most powerful and uncontrollable. Paul always got up before me, and I'd lay in bed thinking about all that stuff. But now I try and block out the images. I try and think about Paula and the kids and all the things I'm going to read and write for the next day. And instead of drawing bondage pictures, I draw happy faces. And I read the Bible. Ask Chris. I often mention the Bible to her when we talk or when I write her letters. Now, somebody listening to this might think, don't they always get into the Bible once they get in prison? Well, I say sometimes the Lord got to sit you down so you can hear him. You know, if he wasn't in prison, you think he would be concerned about the Bible? No, there's too many other things he can be involved with. But in prison, what else you got to do in there but read the Bible? I'm a Christian, you know, he went on. Always have been. After I killed the Oteros, I began to pray to God for help so I could fight this thing inside me. My greatest fear, even more than being caught, was whether God would allow me into heaven or would I be condemned forever. All my life I thought about that, even before I killed anyone. I wondered if God might not accept me because of my deeds, no matter how many times I asked for forgiveness. All this blather about God, the hereafter, and forgiveness made me want to laugh, but I didn't dare. Religion was a part of his facade he had used to fool those around him. Most people were shocked when the news broke that Rader was the president of his church congregation, but I wasn't. When I learned about his longtime ties with the Park City's Christ Lutheran Church, I wanted to shout, "Of course he was!" Really, John Douglas. You know, a lot of wickedness does go on in the church, though. Hmm. Our landmark 10-year study on serial killers revealed as much. We learned that if these guys could choose a profession, it would be minister, police officer, or counselor. Why? Because of the perks, of course. The single most obvious one being that all these professions involve some type of power and control over others. It's not surprising that in prison, many violent offenders gravitate towards religion, not merely to be a member of a group, but rather to lead the group. Charles Tex Watson of the Charles Manson family and David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, are now jailhouse preachers. Things that make you go, hmm. But now I could sense that Raider had begun to loosen up, allowing himself to get comfortable with the idea of speaking to someone such as myself who represented the law enforcement community. According to Casarona, he still harbored resentment towards the cops, telling her he was upset with the way they allowed him to figuratively hang himself during his marathon interrogation sessions. "I know about you," he said, chuckling. "I know about what you think of me." "Do you?" I asked. "Somebody sent me the newsletter from your website, the one you wrote last winter. You don't like guys like me. You think that all of us make choices, so we have to take responsibility for our actions. You said I deserved the death penalty." He paused for a moment, chewed on his lip, then continued. "I believe in capital punishment too, and I suppose I deserve the death penalty. But since I never killed anyone after 1994, I'm not eligible for it." "Is that what kept you from killing after Dolores Davis's murder?" I asked, not completely convinced that he'd taken another life after Kansas reinstated capital punishment in 1994. "No," he said. Rader's words reinforced my belief that he knew exactly what he was doing when he committed his savage murders. It had nothing to do with any split personality, evil twin, or monster living within him. I thought back to how Rader's pastor at Christ Lutheran Church wanted to attribute what happened to his parishioner as an example of how a demonic force can corrupt an otherwise healthy, caring, well-adjusted man. I suppose that was the difference between me and a man of the cloth like Rader's pastor. Things that make you go, hmm, it's not so bad in here, Rada went on, switching the subject. They've got me in a 12 by 9 cell. I have a little window that looks out over the fields. I can see robins out there in the grass. Sometimes I can even see butterflies. I watch a lot of sunsets too. Every night I try and write up a little entry in my journal about the sunset I just watched. I do a lot of writing in here, letters mostly. I get a lot of mail, and I miss being outside and getting to work in my garden. I had a pretty big garden at my house out in the backyard. Maybe one day I'll be able to go out in the backyard here. That might be nice, but I guess it could probably be dangerous too. So I don't know. You'd probably be a celebrity out in the yard, I said. Yeah, I know, he smiled, kind of like a rock star, I guess. He paused again, bent down and wiped sweat, or maybe it could have been tears out of his eyes, and then continued. This is Memorial Day weekend, isn't it? You know, ever since my dad died, I drive out to the cemetery and stick flowers on his grave. Good guy, my old man. I asked Chris to do it for me, to ask him to forgive me, to tell him he didn't have anything to do with the way I turned out, to ask if he'd tell all my victims up in heaven to forgive me, but I'm not sure if Chris will. She's under a lot of pressure, I told him. I know she is, Rada said, but I really like her. I really do. Not in a lover sort of way. It's nothing like that. She's had a hard time because of me, but she's stuck in there for me. I clenched my teeth together. It amazed me how delusional this guy was. The only reason Catherine stuck in there with him was because she had no choice. The people suing her didn't care if she broke her contract with Raider or not. In their eyes, she'd cast her lot with the devil, and those lawsuits were her just desserts. She could crawl into a corner and try to wish it all away. I'd lost count of how many times she claimed to have done that. Or she could keep going and attempt to somehow finish this book that had made her life even more unbearable than it already was. What did she really have to lose? I want to thank you for the essay you wrote, I told him. Chris gave it to me last night. Very interesting, but I've got something to ask you. Beside that question about whether or not your mother was overbearing, you wrote the number 1/2. I can't tell you any more about that, he replied. That's for Chris's book. I'm saving that for her. Are you going to help her get that published? She said you were. Yes, I assured him. I'm going to try to help her, but I can't promise anything. Publishing is a tough business. Raider's gaze dropped to the floor. A scowl crept across his face. Silence. Caserona was correct. Raider looked depressed. His flat, monotone voice and his lifeless eyes were giveaways. Whatever rush he expected by coming clean to the cops and from the media circus that ensued had begun to fade. The depression he'd grappled with for most of his life had no doubt returned, and now he had no way to hide from it. I realized now that Raider hated himself with a passion. He always had. He may not have acted like it or revealed his self-contempt to another person, but deep down he loathed every molecule in his body. And because of that, he was psychologically unable to love others or be loved. I'm confident that over time, He grew fond of Paula and his two kids, but the emotion he experienced when he was around them or thought of them had nothing to do with love. At best, it was a feeling of intense familiarity. I'm drinking. Familiarity. You know what I'm trying to say. Familiarity. Familiarity. There it goes. Write it out. Rada was talking again, but the sound had gone screwy. I heard crackling coming out from my speaker, but I decided to keep talking until Rada indicated that he could no longer hear me. Something else I wanted to ask you, I told him. I had this theory about why you started to cry over the Nancy Fox murder during your sentencing hearing. None of your other kills seemed to affect you, but that one did. You want to hear what I think? Go ahead, he said. Tell me. I heard of this sort of thing happening from other guys I've spoken with, I told him. Something happened during that murder. You always said Nancy Fox was your perfect victim, but after I watched you wipe away those tears, I figured it was because she said something to you, something that really got to you. And at that moment, you suddenly didn't want to kill her, but you knew you had to. You knew you'd gone too far to allow her to live. Raider scrunched up his face into the most serious look I'd seen all morning, appearing to mull over what I just told him. He stared into the camera, but somehow avoided looking at it with his eyes. I was pretty robotic during that whole day in court. I was on autopilot, he said. Wasn't feeling much of anything. The reason I cried after Nancy's father's testimony was because I started thinking about Kerry, my daughter, and I thought about how I'd feel if something like that happened to Nancy Fox happened to her. That made me cry. All right, I'm going on to chapter 24. At this time, I'm just going to take another break and we're going to jam a little bit. And then I'm going to come back and finish chapter 24 and 25. And that will be the end of this book. Like to hear it? Here it go. Let's go, y'all. Let's go.
I want you always. No, 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 no. I want you always. I want you always. People tell me you're not serious, but it doesn't matter. I love you anyway. Girl, in my world, there's just the two of us. They find it hard to see that you're a part of me, and I want you always. Can't be with the loving anyone like this. Honey, you're the best thing. Always. Can't be with the loving anyone like this. Honey, you're the best thing. You're the best thing. You're the best you day and night. Let them know this love is so right. Always and forever. Oh, baby, I want you. Only I know what you're giving me. It will never grow. It's more precious than gold. Ooh, lady, I need your love. This ain't no sometime thing. It's all I want you to know. Girl, I get so excited, finding it hard to hide it. You got me going through the ceiling and I'm riding on the feeling. And I can't remember loving anyone like this. My, oh my, girl, I need your love. Always, I can't remember loving anyone like this. Honey, you're the best thing. I want you always. I want you always.
Almost slipped and bust my ass. Back, nevertheless, I'm back. Whew. Hey, Long Island iced tea, boy, it'll sneak up on you. All right, here we go. Oh, there you go. All right, chapter 24. I stared at Raider's image on my screen. His mouth was moving, but the damn speaker appeared to have gone dead again. Because the only thing that ever came out of Raider's mouth was emptiness cloaked in words, I tried to convince myself that the malfunctioning sound system didn't matter. But I motioned for a guard to come over and fix it anyway. And after a few moments spent shaking some wires and tapping the side of the TV monitor, the guard coaxed the speaker back to life, catching Raider in the midst of a ramble about what compelled him to commit his first murder. You already know what the precipitating event was, he said. It was all because of my getting laid off at Cessna. I wasn't having any sexual problems with my wife or financial problems. It was all because of unemployment. It didn't seem fair. It just didn't even seem fair. I really loved that job. Back up a minute, I said. The sound went on the fritz for a few minutes, just as you were about to tell me what it was that drove you. A tiny smile returned to Raider's face. He seemed to be enjoying this. It was all psychological, he said. My whole thing when I went into someone's house was based on a fantasy of bondage. I was especially into self-bondage. I wasn't a sadist. I never pulled the fingernails or toenails out of anyone. Sex was never part of my fantasy either. I wanted power. I guess that's what I was really looking for. That's why Nancy Fox was my most perfect victim. I got to spend plenty of time with her without any interruptions. Tell me about your neighbor, Marine Hedge, I asked, hoping to get him talking about his various murders. You carried her to the basement of your church. Raider twisted his face into another one of his ridiculous, pensive expressions. Yes, she was a good one, he said after a few moments of thought. I really enjoyed that one, but you know what? Over the years, all the burglaries I began doing were almost as satisfying as the killing. I broke into a lot of houses, stole watches and jewelry and underwear. But it's just like you wrote in your books. The fantasy is better than the crime. Because in my fantasies, everything was under control. I played the director and the lead actor. Like I told you before, it's just like watching a movie. I see myself committing the crime, doing all the things I did in real life, only without all the headache or frustration. Because in real life, things never quite turned out the way I wanted them to, the way I expected. My victims always seemed to react in ways I didn't plan. Then Rada said, "You know, if there was one killer who I could identify with, it was Harvey Glatman." I knew whom he meant. I said, "Yes, he was into binding and psychologically torturing his victims just like you. He was also the first serial killer we know of who chronicled every aspect of his murders with a camera and later developed the pictures in his home darkroom." Harvey Glatman, huh? Rada's smile grew larger. The memory of this kindred spirit appeared to have lifted his mood. "Chris told me about the book," I said. "Last night she told me all about it." "You mean Glatman's book, right?" "Yeah," I replied. "Glatman's book. You told her that if she really wanted to understand you, all she needed to do was read the back cover of the book, the last couple of sentences." "Chris told you that?" he asked, looking alarmed that she would have leaked this bit of information to me. "You remember what the back of the book says?" I asked. "Because I do. I memorized it." "You did?" he asked, obviously flattered that I'd gone to the trouble of memorizing something that I'd been told was so important to him. "For decades," I said, reciting the copy from the back cover. These infamous deeds would inspire television and movie plots. But until now, there has been no definitive account for the forces that drove one of America's most legendary serial killers. And never before has it been explained why, for Harvey Glatman, his crimes weren't about killing, rape, and torturing at all. They were all about the rope. Raider sat there, moving his lips as though he were repeating the words I just recited to him. I waited for him to say something, but he remained silent, so I spoke. "So all you really cared about was binding your victims with rope?" I asked. "Was the hunting for victims, even the killing, just secondary? Your fantasy was to look at someone who you had totally immobilized and made powerless, someone who you were in total control of, feel, free to do as you pleased." He nodded, listening to me as though I were a doctor describing some type of physical condition that had troubled him for most of his life. "So you never really wanted to sexually assault them? That would almost be like cheating on Paula, and you certainly didn't want to do that. What you wanted to do was masturbate as you looked down at the crime scene you created for yourself." I waited for Raider to say something, but he remained silent. Judging from the look on his face, I wasn't telling him anything he didn't already know about himself. But he never heard it come from someone else's mouth before, and he seemed almost stunned by it, as if I held up a mirror in front of his face, and the image he glimpsed staring back confused him. A few moments later, he stammered. But I was a little bit different than Glatman. He didn't communicate with the police, and he didn't have a wife, a family, and all my social obligations. Next, I brought in another serial killer, as I knew he loved the comparisons. I once mentioned your case to convince David Berkowitz, that Son of Sam guy, to speak with me. Rader's face brightened when he heard that. You used me to get to Berkowitz? When would that have been? What year? That was in 1981, I told him, back when you were still working for ADT. You know a lot about me, he said, smiling, but Berkowitz was also different than me. He was after lovers in the park, and his crimes, like you wrote in one of your books, were impersonal. They have another serial killer in here named John Robinson. Oh, I know all about John Robinson, I told him. I wrote about a book about him several years ago. You did? I never seen that one. Nobody did, I said. Nobody wanted to read about John Robinson. He was sort of like me because of all the bondage stuff he was into, Rader said. But he was into that whole discipline and masochistic stuff, which I'm not. He was more sophisticated than me when he chose his victims. He often used the internet to lure them in. I found mine the old-fashioned way. I got my car and started driving. You know, I used to love driving around with classical music on, looking for projects in areas where I felt comfortable, where I knew my way around and felt familiar with the streets. I can't tell you how many times I cruised past the homes of my past victims over the years. I'd slow down and stare at the house and felt this feeling of accomplishment settle over me because that house was my trophy. It reminded me of what I'd gotten away with, of a secret I knew and nobody else did. Did you ever visit the graves of any of your victims? I asked. No, but I cut their obituaries out of the newspaper and read them over and over again. But I never went to the cemeteries, though. I read that the cops sometimes stalked out those places, so it didn't seem to be a safe place to go. What about if the police had organized a community meeting for residents in order to update them on the killings and ask for citizen volunteers? Would you have attended? I asked. No way, he said, shaking his head. I'd know for certain that the place would be filled with police just waiting for me to show up. I told him about my super cop theory, explaining how the intended goal was to make the unsub meaning unidentified subject, identify with a single officer instead of an entire police force. As he listened, his eyes grew wide and his tongue darted over his top lip, darted over his top lip as if he were trying to wet it. Yes, he said, grasping what it was I was speaking about. Ken Landwehr was kind of like that. For the longest time, I really liked him. He seemed like a good cop, a straight shooter. The two of us would have had a lot to talk about. Before they caught me, I sometimes thought about what it would be like to sit down with him and have a good long talk about everything. But then he lied to me about the computer disk and called me all those names, said I was a sick pervert and all of that. I respected him, but I don't respect him now. Did you get that? I'm going to read that again. This is another example of odd thinking. Ken Landwehr was kind of like that. For the longest time, I really liked him. He seemed like a good cop, a straight shooter. The two of us would have had a lot to talk about. I'm going to stop there. You are a sick, murdering pervert, to say the least. And you think that you and this top cop detective, or whatever Landwehr was, would have a lot to talk about. You'll have absolutely nothing in common. You are at the two of you are the polar opposites. But in BTK's mind, Landwehr was a good guy, and they probably would have been the best of friends if Landwehr, the detective, the cop, whatever position he held, didn't lie to him. You know, before they caught me, I sometimes thought about what it would be like to sit down with him and have a good long talk about everything. Like they would just be old buddies, old pals. But then he lied to me about the computer disk and called me all those names. How dare he call me all those names? This fool who was murdering people, masturbating over the, the murdered body of an 11-year-old girl, all this crazy shit. And he got the nerve to be incensed because somebody called him names, names that were befitting for him. But then he lied to me about the computer disk and called me all those names, said I was a sick pervert and all that. I respected him, but I don't respect him now. Yeah, don't you dare call a pervert a pervert. He'll lose all respect for you. Fuck out of here. I think the guy I liked best was Richard Lemunion. He was the chief of police back in the 1970s. Seemed like a real nice guy. I was hoping that he and I could sit down and have a cup of coffee at the jail after my arrest, but he never came. So he thought the chief of police, Richard, what's his name? Lemunion, was a real great guy. The chief of police back in the 1970s. And in his warped mind, that odd thinking, he was hoping that he and the chief of police, who had been looking for his perverted, sick, sadistic BTK, bind, torture, kill, serial killing ass, would want to sit down and have a cup of coffee with him. Odd thinking. It's one of the traits of a psychopath. Amazing. Rader still believed that he and the police shared some sort of professional I've been drinking. Camaraderie. There, I said it. Don't expect me to say it again. I suspected that BTK was a wannabe cop back when I first looked at the case in 1979, but until sitting here and listening to him speak, I hadn't realized how entrenched his delusion was. If only we'd been able to better capitalize on this frailty of his to use it against him. Part of me wanted to reach through the TV monitor and beat some sense into his brain. Talk about paradoxes. Rader was too savvy to visit one of his victims' graves or attend a community meeting, yet he somehow believed that Landwehr or Lamunion would actually sit down to have a cup of coffee with him and chew the fat. How did it make you feel when Lamunion stood up at that press conference in 1979 and announced that the police had no leads in the killings? I asked. That felt good. No. That felt great. It meant the police didn't know anything. It meant I could relax and stop looking over my shoulder every 2 minutes. That was tiring. But something I didn't like was when that district attorney said I used to hang myself at Boy Scout outings. That's not true. It's just not true. I wish you could clear that up for me in your book. I never did that. I never would have done that. That's one of those things that really bothers me. I love the Boy Scouts far too much to have ever done anything like that during a camp out. The fact that Rader strangled his neighbor during a Boy Scout campout didn't bother him in the least. Like every criminal, violent and nonviolent, he had his own twisted code of ethics. Murder was one thing. He just didn't want anyone to think he was the type who might do something weird like hang himself during a scout outing. Rader, of course, didn't know what I knew about him. I'd read an entry in his journal detailing his late night exploits in the back of his truck during a campout during the mid 1980s. On that autumn night, Rader didn't wrap a rope around his throat, but he did strip off his clothes, pull on a pair of women's underwear and bra, wrap himself up in ropes and dog collars, and clamp a pair of handcuffs over his hands. Problem was, the damn lock got jammed and he couldn't remove the cuffs. So he lay there in the back of his truck, thrashing and grunting, sweating like a pig as he desperately tried to free himself. He wrote in his journal that at one point he feared he might have to begin shouting for one of his scouts to help extricate him from his bindings. But then, at the last moment, all that perspiration lathering his body allowed his wrists to slide out of his cuffs. He removed the rest of his bindings, cleaned himself up, then returned to the campfire to listen to ghost stories and instruct whoever might be interested on some advanced knot tying tips. Rader's mouth was primed and ready now. Even if he didn't want them to, the words had begun to spill out of his mouth. I could push a bit harder, lean on him with just a little more force in order to get him to take me where I wanted to go. Next, I decided to ask him about his earliest victims, the animals. Since his arrest, Rader had flip-flopped over the issue of whether he bound, tortured, or killed any animals while he was growing up. His diaries touched on the subject. During his marathon gabfest with the police, he confirmed as much, explaining he'd often take the animals to a barn near his house and kill them. But lately Rader had changed his tune, telling Casarona that he never would have taken the life of an animal because he loved them far too much. Are you following this, listeners? He would never have taken the life of an animal because he loved them far too much. But oh, he would slaughter human beings in a blink of an eye, wouldn't he? Tell me about the animals, Dennis, I said. How did you kill them? And why always in the barn? The face of the man on my TV monitor went stern, his thick, bushy eyebrows arched downward. I know where you're going with this. It's part of that homicidal triangle, along with bedwetting and starting fires. But I never killed any animals. I would never have done that. You know, at one time I wanted to be a vet, so I just couldn't do something like that to an animal. I knew he was lying, but I also knew that I didn't dare call his bluff. All I could do was try to salvage a part of the truth. Okay, so you didn't kill them, but you tied a few dogs and cats up, right? I asked. And why always in the barns? What was it about barns? For the first time all morning, he looked almost embarrassed. In his mind, torturing and killing humans was one thing, but performing the same atrocities on animals was something else altogether. I just always felt safe in a barn, he said, just something about them. Maybe because barns are always detached from the house, separate, off away by itself. You can do things in a barn and no one will interrupt you. It's more private than a basement, and I always liked basements. Did a lot of stuff in my parents' basement. He stopped talking. Judging from the angle of his eyes in relation to the video camera in front of him, he was once again staring at the floor. He looked ashamed. I never killed any animals, he said, but I did tie some up, and then I masturbated next to them. Why would he cop to it, I wondered. Why wouldn't he cop to it? Why couldn't he admit to torturing and killing an animal? Part of the answer had to do with the contradictory, unsettling nature of violent criminals. They'll elaborate on the goriest details of a case, but then turn evasive over some minor point. In other words, Rada was embarrassed. I'd spent enough time working on farms in high school, hoping to earn school credits to get into a vet school, to know what sort of unspoken things sometimes occurred on a farm when no one was watching. Really, John Douglas, tell us more. What kind of shit were you doing with animals on a farm, in a barn? Things that make you go, hmm. At Montana State University, where I spent a few years as an undergraduate, the co-eds had a motto that went something like Montana State, where men are men and sheep are nervous. Oh, damn. That pretty much summed things up. Seeing Raider's shamed expression, I not only realized that he had killed his share of animals as a youth, but also wouldn't have been surprised if he engaged in a bit of sexual experimentation with them as well. So now you're accusing BTK of being an animal fucker? John Douglas? How dare you be so right? That was what led me to ask my next question. Tell me about your fascination with autoeroticism, I asked. Raider's green eyes did a double take. His face went blank. What's that? Autoeroticism? He asked. Once again, I realized we'd given him far too much credit. He appeared to have no idea that the activity he performed with rope during his motel parties out in the privacy of the woods or down in his parents' basement actually had a name. For all he knew, when I used the term autoeroticism, I was talking about inserting a portion of his anatomy into the exhaust pipe of a car. So I explained the clinical definition of the term, and Raider once again shook his head back and forth, claiming he'd never hung himself because it was too risky. Oh, he's a fucking liar, y'all. Did y'all see the picture? I did a video of the. Oh, it's on the other channel, the other Madam Whip-ass channel, because she. No, wait a minute. No, it's on this channel. But if you click the videos link, you know how you have links says home, videos, live, community. Go to the videos, and there's some pictures in this book of Inside the Mind of BTK. If you go to that video, you will see pictures that Dennis Rader took of himself hanging himself with rope, all kinds of ways. What is he talking about? He never hung himself. That you took pictures as like he took like 200 pictures. He had a whole stash, what he called the mother load. I just read something about motel parties. This is his term. He would have motel parties. What's a motel party? A motel party is when he would book a motel room, him by himself, with his bondage shit and his Polaroid camera and his lingerie and stockings and mask and wigs and bras and shit. And he would tie himself up. He would hang himself with rope. He had a rope fetish. It was something about rope and tying these extravagant knots. And he was so prolific in it that he could hang himself and not really hang himself, you know? And he had a Polaroid camera, and some of the pictures you could see a black cord. I don't know if Polaroid cameras, you could get them like that back in the day, or did he jimmy it so that he could pull his cord and snap his own pictures? He was the original selfie taker way back in the early 1970s, and he took selfies of himself dressed in women's clothing with a wig and sometimes a mask and bondaged up and with rope and all types of stuff. There's 200, over 200 of those kinds of pictures. The pictures that are out on the internet is only 5 of them. 5 out of 200 pictures. I would hope they would release all of those other pictures. I would hope they would, but they're not. Who knows? Maybe 20 years from now. But I'd like to see that shit because the 5 that they did release, you look at that, you be like, what the fuck? It's weird shit, y'all. Weird shit. And he's a fucking pathological liar to talk about, oh, I never hung myself. But there's pictures of you hanging yourself. Let me start back before I went on my tangent, my rant. So I explained the clinical definition of the term, and Rader once again shook his head back and forth, claiming he'd never hung himself because it was too risky. I just wouldn't do that, he said, his head down, his head now turned sideways. That's far too dangerous. People die doing that sort of stuff, and that was the last thing I wanted to have happen. He was lying, of course. Not only had several reliable sources confirmed as much, but I also knew that he had written about this activity far too many times in his journals for it not to be true. Yet Rader's twist on autoeroticism was unique. Unlike all the other cases I'd researched, he didn't hang or suffocate himself in order to intensify an orgasm. It turned out that his sense of what caused him to get aroused was so tweaked that merely the sensation of being hung or suffocated was enough to induce an orgasm. I'd never heard of anything like this. Sitting there thinking about Rader stringing himself up made me think about Paula Rader. Plenty of the killers I'd tracked were married to women all cut from the same cloth. Placid, easy to please, the kind of women who wouldn't snoop around in her husband's belongings. Yeah, a non-black woman. Dennis Rader could not have been BTK for 30 minutes after he told his black wife, if he had one, that's my drawer, don't ever look in it. Because as soon as he left his house to go on his ADT job, that black woman, wife of his, would have went straight to that fucking drawer. You know it, and I know it. Then a new thought occurred to me. I would have wagered a case of Corona, Rader's favorite beer, that at least once in his 30 plus years of marriage to her, Paula had walked in on Dennis in the midst of one of his kinky necktie parties. Man, I said, this has got to be really rough on your wife. Knowing that I made it this far without Rader walking out on me or shutting down made me a bit bolder. But I still didn't want to burn any bridges. If I played my cards wisely, I could pump him for more information long after this interview wrapped up, using Casarona as an intermediary. So I just grinned at him, one of those I might know more than you shit-eating kind of smiles. He knew damn well I was working him. He couldn't be that dense. He understood that I was beginning to sense something about Paula, something nobody else knew. His ugly face glared intently at the camera. And when interviewing killers like Rader, I always tried to imagine what their faces looked like during one of their homicidal frenzies. I wondered if the expression I was staring at on my monitor was the same face his victims saw. Paula never knew anything, he said in a low growl. She didn't know a thing, and they're punishing her. She deserves to get some compensation from the sale of the house, but they don't want her to, and I hope someday she'll forgive me for all of this. Tears poured down his cheeks. Touching. Really. That is, if one didn't understand that Rader wasn't crying for Paula, His tears were still exclusively for himself. I gave him a few moments to wallow in self-pity. And finally I said, "No, I don't think Paula knew anything exactly, but what I'm wondering is if she ever saw anything. There's a difference, you know. There's a difference between knowing and seeing." Yeah, 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 was the only word Raider uttered. His gaze appeared to be focused to the left of the video camera somewhere in front of him. He appeared dazed, lost inside the world behind his eyelids. I let him have a few minutes for himself to think things over, to let the seeds I just dropped into his brain take root. Anything else you want to tell me? I watched Raider double over again, attempting to smear what I knew to be tears from his eyes. But by the time he raised his head back up, he looked more composed. You know, lately I've been thinking about what people can do to protect themselves from guys like me. And I came up with a little list, he said. I guess most of it is pretty obvious, but I'll tell it to you if you like. I'm all ears, I said. The first thing I'd suggest for a woman living alone is to get a security system, he said. I have ADT, I told him, remembering how Raider once rigged a home alarm system he helped install for ADT, such that if the mood struck him, he could break in and kill the female occupant. You do? He exclaimed. They're a really great company. I worked for them for years, you know. I really liked that job. I imagine you did, I replied. But back to my list, he said, aware that the clock was ticking. For women living alone, I think the most important thing they can do is give the impression that they live with a man. Maybe have some men's clothing scattered around the house or leave a toiletry kit out in the open just in case someone breaks in to scope the place out. It would be wise to have two dogs, one outside and another one inside. And on the answering machine, have a man's voice on the outgoing recording. And you know how I used to cut the phone lines of houses? People should always check their phones whenever they enter their house. His voice trailed off, realizing how antiquated that piece of advice sounded. Since everybody seems to have cell phones these days, maybe that's not so important. But I do think it's a good idea to always leave the radio on in your house and avoid routines. Never take the same route to and from work or someplace like the grocery store. And the last thing would be for women to be extra suspicious of vehicles they see parked out in front of their house or apartment. I often used to drive back to my victims' homes over and over again, and yeah, park out front. Raider's face once again went blank. His sweat-drenched head bobbed up and down. Is that it? I asked, not exactly overwhelmed by his crime safety tips. Yeah, just off the top of my head, that's what came to me. A guard walked toward me, tapping his wristwatch. Yeah, I think we've got to wrap this up, Dennis. Yeah, he said, I guess you and I have run out of time. We stared at one another's image on our monitors. Neither of us spoke a word. I thought about a line from Truman Capote's classic book, In Cold Blood, detailing the 1959 farmhouse slaying of a family that lived in a small Kansas town west of Wichita. In it, Capote wrote off his strange bond with one of the killers, Perry Smith. Oh, wait a minute. In it, Capote wrote of his strange bond with one of the killers, Perry Smith. It's as if Perry and I grew up in the same house. One day, I went out the front door and he went out the back. I sure couldn't say that about Raider and me, despite the uncanny biographical similarities we share. We were born the same year. Both of us wanted to be veterinarians, and we graduated from high school the same year, joined and were discharged from the Air Force the same year, and were married the same year. I felt not a shred of kinship with the man. Nothing except a professional curiosity about the way his brain worked and what I might be able to learn to help the authorities keep someone like him from going so long without detection. I'd like to think that if Rada and I had grown up in the same house, I would have had the courtesy to find some way to drop a cinder block on his head and put him out of his misery long before he began inflicting his nightmare on others. I'm trying to control it. I am, he said, but the scary thing was how quickly the urge could come over me. I could be staring out the window looking at something and it would suddenly be on me and it would take me over. But I'm trying to get the upper hand now that I'm in here, you know. The other day, the guards were walking me to the shower, and a bunch of the guys in the cells I passed began chanting, BTK, BTK, BTK. And I listened for a couple of seconds. Then I stopped dead in my tracks and I looked right at them and I told them, I'm not BTK, I'm Dennis Rader. Then I walked on to the shower. I watched as Rader's eyes moved deftly and subtly from the camera down to the screen, no doubt studying my reaction to what he just told me. Nice story, Dennis, I told him, because that was just what I believed it to be. A piece of fiction created solely for my benefit, for however much time Rada had left on this planet. And if you ask me, he was living on borrowed time. He would forever be BTK. Being BTK was all he knew, all he ever did know. The Dennis Rader bit was just another gimmick, another ruse like some frustrated former high school quarterback sliding into middle age. He would forever be reliving his conquests until the day he took his last breath, something that couldn't come soon enough as far as I was concerned. You know, I really like speaking with you, he said. It felt good to talk about this stuff. Maybe when all this dies down, you can come back and we could talk face to face without all the cameras. Maybe, I told him. I'll see you later, perhaps. Goodbye, sir, he said. The screen went gray, then black, and the image of Dennis Rader disappeared. Whew, that was a deep one. We got the last chapter, chapter 25. Long ass chapter. Jesus Christ. What do I do at this point? Do I play another song so I can take a break? Or do I end it now and then come back perhaps Monday and read the final chapter? What should I do? Is anybody like listening, in real time? I see one person there, and if you're still hanging out with me, I'll read the final chapter just for you. But let me find a good song to play. You know what? I got one. I'm gonna play this song. Every time I hear this song, it makes me think of my best friend. She passed. She was a year older than me. She passed away at the age of 20 back in 1987. But every time I hear this song, it makes me think of she. And I don't know. I've been thinking about her a lot this week. And I heard her this morning. So here we go. And I'll be back shortly. Wait a minute. Wait. Can't play that yet. I have to do something. I have to go to present. All right. This is the final song. Then I'm going to come back with the final chapter. Thank you for being so patient. Rest in peace, Shahadi. I miss you so much.
Since you came into my life, you are my love life, this I know, and I'll never let you go. You're my all, part of me. Once I was lost and now found, then you turned my world around. When I need, I call your name. 'Cause I never knew love like this before. Open my eyes, 'cause I never knew love like this before. What a surprise, 'cause I never knew love like this before. This feeling so deep inside of me, such a tender fantasy. You're the one I'm living for. You are my sunlight and my rain, and time could never change what we share forevermore. Ooh, I never knew love like this before. Now I'm lonely nevermore. Since you came into my life, 'cause I never call your name. 'Cause I never knew love like this before. Open my eyes, 'cause I never knew love like this before. What a surprise, 'cause I never knew love like this before. Inside of me, never knew love like this before. Open my eyes, never,
Okay, so got 20 more pages to read. If you would be so kind to donate to the Jumanji and Diva Stainless Steel Birdcage Fund, it'd be greatly appreciated. I played music all through these last two reading sessions, including this one here. So I'm not going to be monetized for this particular video. So all proceeds are going to a brand new cage for them. You know, the one they're in is huge, it's cool, but with my lifestyle and how much I'll be doing, I need a stainless steel cage that is a lot easier to clean, that I can take care of it in no time and keep it moving. So it's up to you. Hit Madam Wetbass on the $sign. It'll be greatly appreciated. And let's go. We're coming down the mountain. 20 more pages. Final chapter, chapter 25. A few hours later, back in Wichita, Chris Casarona had a smile plastered on her face as she walked into the lobby of my hotel and took a seat in the tiny lounge. "It's over," she said. "It's so over. I can't believe I just threw away my exclusivity like that. I just got off the phone with one of my friends. They can't believe I did this. Now I have nothing." I sat there watching her, sipping my Chardonnay, not saying a word. "You want a drink?" I asked. "Yeah, Jack Daniels and Coke. You know, the code word that Dennis and I use for you is Daniel because you've got the same initials as Jack Daniels, JD." "Why in God's name do you need a code name for me?" "It was Dennis's idea," she said, "but we were both convinced that whenever we spoke to one another, the police were listening to us." "They probably were," I told her. "Or they should have been, you know. They want to be able to pin another murder on Dennis, something after 1994, so they can stick him on death row." "I know. If he doesn't deserve the death penalty, who does? But I don't think he killed anyone after 1991. "Neither do I told her. "He certainly never wrote about it in any of his journals, and he seemed to write about everything. I don't think he would have been able to leave something like that out." Casarona's drink arrived. She raised her lips to the glass and drained part of it, shutting her eyes for a few brief moments as it slid down her throat. We sat there in silence, listening to the old man in a tuxedo playing show tunes on a piano. I need to ask you something, I said. Something I've been wondering about since Ken Landwehr mentioned it to me. Did Dennis ever tell you what happened just before he killed Julie Otero? What do you mean? I told her what I learned about that January morning back in 1974 as he straddled Julie's Otero's body on the bed and wrapped his sweat-drenched hands sheathed in rubber gloves around her throat. On the floor nearby, Joseph lay dead with a pillowcase tied over his head. In her heart, Julie must have known that her 11-year-old daughter and 9-year-old son would probably soon be joining him, if they hadn't already. She was next, and she must have known that. She didn't have a chance, and I couldn't imagine a more hopeless, powerless situation. Yet, something inside this doomed woman allowed her to gaze up into Rada's face and whisper, "May God have mercy on your soul." How does someone summon up such grace at such a terrible, horrifying moment? I've, o- I've often wondered. It was a question I thought about from time to time, a question I never had been able to answer. So, did he ever tell you anything about that? Did he ever tell you how her words affected him? Cassarona polished off her drink and motioned for the waitress to bring her another. Uh, yeah, he told me about that. He told me that Julie's words dazed him. He told me that several days passed before he even remembered what she'd said to him. And then what? I asked. And then he didn't think about it again for another 3 decades, he said. But lately he has. Hmm, prison can do that to a guy, I said. A lot of Bush League philosophers in prison. What he told me was that he's begun to see Julie as a saint, Cassarona said, which is also how he started to see Paula. Nothing like hindsight, I suppose, I said. Yeah, she said, taking a sip out of her new drink and then chewing on a chunk of ice. She placed the glass back on the table. So, tell me what Dennis said to you. Tell me everything. Tell me everything. So I did. It was the least I could do for Chris Cassarona. By the time I started back to my room, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and I placed the key in my door, twisted it, then pushed it open. The first thing I noticed was a white envelope sitting on the burgundy carpet. Nothing was written on the front of it. I opened it and pulled out 3 typewritten pages. Whoever had written the letter felt the need to make one thing clear up front. None of what appeared on the pages that followed were to be quoted in my book. The reason I'd been sent this material was so that I might have all the facts. Whether or not I chose to use them in my book was up to me. I fumbled for my reading glasses, then sat down on the edge of my bed and started reading, slowly, one word at a time, backing up every few words and going over what I just ingested. 10 minutes later, I finished. I folded the letter up, placed it back in the envelope, then lay down on the bed to think. Whoever had written this was either close to Dennis or a confidant of Paula. Exactly why it came to be sitting inside my hotel room was hardly surprising. Wichita may be the largest city in Kansas, but gossip still moves through it the way it does in a small town. No doubt word had leaked out fast that I was coming here to interview Dennis, and someone had decided to help me in a way not unlike anonymous tipsters do, but when they phone police with a scrap of crucial information to help solve a crime. I sensed that whoever wrote this note wanted to provide law enforcement with some useful, concrete information that would shed light on one of the most enigmatic, unanswered questions about BTK, namely, why he went underground for so many years. It's only by understanding the answer to that question that we can find better, more effective ways to ensure that we never have another Dennis Rader. And my hunch was spot on. It had gone down much of the way I'd imagined. According to my letter, the first time Rader had to go underground was in the autumn of 1978, when Paula walked into the tiny bedroom she shared with her husband and found herself staring at something that just about killed her. Her husband, Dennis, had tied a rope around his neck and was hanging himself from a door in front of the bathroom mirror. He wore a dress, probably stolen during one of the countless home burglaries he had committed. Nothing in Paula's sheltered, cloistered life spent in sleepy Park City could have prepared her for that strange sight. Rader told my source that this happened a few months after Carrie's birth in June of 1978. By then, Shirley Vian had been dead for roughly 18 months. 10 months had passed since Nancy Fox's murder, which he considered his homicidal masterpiece. And in February 1978, he had penned his infamous screed to police, announcing that there was a new serial killer on the block and that he was unstoppable. Fear and paranoia gnawed at the heart and soul of every resident in Wichita. Rader must have prided himself that he was at the pinnacle of his career as a serial killer. Then he seemed to vanish into hot, humid air of western Kansas. I'd never been able to answer why he disappeared, but now I could. According to the letter, Rader claimed that Paula's discovery marked the most humiliating, embarrassing day of his entire life. Far worse, he said, than his arrest 25 years later. He told this source that he had been prepared to get down on his knees and beg her for forgiveness. But it never came to that. His wife reportedly wasn't so much angry as she was sickened and concerned that something was terribly wrong with her husband's brain. She never heard of anyone doing something so downright disturbing and strange. Y'all, would y'all consider that a red flag? You come home and find your husband hanging in the bathroom door in women's clothing in front of the mirror in the bathroom? Would that be a red flag that he's a serial killer? Would your mind even go down serial killer lane at that site? Well, it might now, knowing about serial killers and Dennis Rader. But we're going back to 1978 when the term serial killer had not even been coined yet. It wasn't coined until the 80s. So, what would you think if you found your husband hanging in a doorway dressed in women's lingerie in front of the bathroom mirror? How would you handle that? Do you divorce your husband right away? Do you say, yeah, let's go get you some therapy? What do you do? You need help, she reportedly told him. So I guess when they arrested him, and that's why, all the pieces of the puzzle just came together with his arrest. Remember, he was writing a letter and at the table, and she came and peered over his shoulder and said, "You know what? You spell just like BTK." And then remember, they were sitting in the living room on the couch watching the 6 o'clock news, and BTK had called the police and said, "You will find a murder at 843 Pershing Street, Nancy Fox." And they kept playing that recording over and over on the news. And they're sitting there watching it. And she turns to him and says, "You know, you sound just like BTK." And she goes back watching the news broadcast. And that was way back in the 70s when that took place with that recording. And that was damn near 25 years later. And he gets arrested as the BTK killer. Imagine that. Imagine standing in Paula Rader's shoes. And then you remember how you caught him twice hanging himself? All these little weird shit that you've seen over the course of 30 years of marriage. And upon his arrest, it all starts to make sense to you. You need help, she reportedly told him. The only problem was that she had no idea whom to turn to, especially as she was so embarrassed by it all, far too embarrassed ever to have the stomach to tell anyone about what had happened. This no doubt must have pleased the hell out of Rader, who described his wife to one of my sources as sweet, sincere, naive, and the most reserved woman he'd ever known. Okay, so this is the early 1970s. You've been born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. You find your husband doing some weird shit by hanging himself in the doorway of your bathroom in front of the mirror dressed in women's clothing. Now, this ain't a woman that was born in the streets of New York City where you can see that shit. Well, something close to it anyway in New York City, but not in Wichita, Kansas. And if you're like, I don't know, the mother of Leave It to Beaver, you know, how do you even articulate the words to tell somebody to ask for help in a place like Wichita, Kansas? Now, on the other hand, if she was in New York, hey, there's freaks all over the place. There's weirdos all over the place. It's easy to go to some professional and say, "Look, this is my husband. Tell him, Dennis, what you've been doing. If you don't tell this therapist, I'll tell him. You know what? Fuck you, Dennis. I'm going to tell the therapist. This little weird little fucking freak of a husband I got, I came home and you guess what I caught him doing? this little fucking freaky pervert widow was hanging himself in our bathroom doorway. Hanging himself. God knows how he was able to do that shit. But he was dressed in women's lingerie. By the way, I never even asked you, motherfucker, where did you get this lingerie from? Because it didn't come from me. That's a whole nother motherfucker. You know what? I'm sitting here in third. Motherfucker, I'm out, done. Getting a divorce. But that would be a New York Paula Rader. Wichita, Kansas Paula Rader. It's like, this is my husband. And I just can't even bear to tell anybody this. So you just eventually brush it under the rug. He says he'll never do it again. And you have no choice but to believe him so that shit can get back to your quote unquote normal. And you can go on back to your Mayberry way of life. Obviously, it was her naivete that Rada found most attractive about Paula. Because even though the cat was out of the bag, Dennis couldn't have picked a better person with whom to have accidentally shared his secret. She was close to her mother, her two sisters, and a friend in Missouri, but he was fairly certain she'd never breathe a word of what she'd seen him doing to a single living soul. Who knows? Perhaps this was the real reason why this always calculating, perpetually plotting psychopath chose Paula to be his wife in the first place. Having Rada speak with a therapist or a counselor was out of the question, Paula informed Dennis. It petrified her to imagine what people might think if word ever got out. And Lord only knows that it would in a town as small as Wichita. So, in a matter of days, Paula decided to summon up enough courage to telephone the VA hospital in Wichita, where she'd once worked as a bookkeeper back during the Otero murders. And without identifying herself, she asked to speak to a therapist over the phone, confiding that a friend of hers had had a problem with her husband and wondered whether they had any suggestions on how it might be handled. Whomever she spoke with gave her a list of several self-help books that addressed the issue she described. She bought every single title she could find and gave the books to Dennis, telling him he'd better read them and memorize every single page. According to my source, he attempted to do just that. Rader claimed that his biggest fear was that Paula would leave him, the source insisted. This made perfect sense. Without Paula, he would have no one running interference for him, no one to cover for him. And even though Paula had no earthly idea that this was what she was doing, Rader knew that without Paula, it might be just a matter of time before people began wondering about him, giving him second looks, and possibly starting to point fingers at him. Paula's departure from his life, he guessed, could very well be the beginning of the end. And Rader told my source that for the next 2 years he tried to clean up his act, at least when it came to practicing his unique form of autoeroticism. He did his best to go cold turkey from the rope. Oh, this John is a fucking comedian, I tell you. He said he tried to do his best to go cold turkey from the rope. Oh, ooh, John. You should do stand up, brother. Cold turkey from the rope. Mm-mm-mm. I have no idea what Raider did to quench his terrible, destructive hunger for the next 2 years. All I know is that one afternoon in 1980, it happened again. Paula walked into the bedroom and caught him with another rope around his neck. Now, if this was a black Paula Raider, if she would have given him a second chance, here she go walking into a bedroom, catching her husband with a rope. She'd be like, this motherfucker here. Mm-mm. This time, Raider told my source his wife, no longer concerned that something might be wrong inside of her husband's head. Instead, she was angry, just plain ticked off, mad as a goddamn hornet. This was obviously a reaction Raider hadn't foreseen, so he took what was a very calculated gamble. He informed Paula that he'd be willing to move out of the house, no doubt keeping his fingers crossed that she'd let him stay. Instead, Paula reportedly replied that she'd contemplate his offer, and for the next few weeks, she barely uttered a single word to him. Eventually, she came around, although I think this was probably because she realized that allowing Dennis to leave would cause people to begin asking questions, something Raider knew his wife would not want. She told him he could stay, but issued an ultimatum that even he knew he could never violate. Paula, according to my letter, tersely informed her husband that he had better never do it again. And Raider didn't. At least that's what he told my source. He never again put on a dress and hung himself from the bathroom door. The inside of the Raider home became off limits for that sort of overt, blatantly strange activity. Instead, he waited for one of his motel parties or when he was alone out in the woods to break out his rope. Oh, John, I don't know what it is, Mr. Douglas, but this rope shit, man. You just have a way with words just as intensely as Dennis has a way with rope. Could you imagine looking at rope and getting aroused? That's Dennis Rader. You see a piece of rope and you be like, ooh, the fuck? Where do these fucking people come from? How are they fucking made? Okay, where am I? Oh man, I lost my spot. He knew that Paula would probably never give him another chance. Even worse, he feared she might begin connecting the dots that would link his bizarre actions with those of the mysterious strangler everyone in Wichita seemed to be talking about. It was late and I was wiped out. I picked up the phone and dialed the front desk. Did somebody drop off a letter for me at the front desk? I asked the clerk. Hold on. A moment later, she returned to the line. No, were you expecting one? I awoke the next morning after my trip to El Dorado with a dream about death still fresh in my head. I couldn't recall the specifics, but I knew I'd been murdered sometime in the night when my eyes were shut. I've always believed that of all the ways to go out, That would be the easiest, simply to shut your eyes and never open them again. Far kinder and more humane than most of the murder cases I had worked on in my lifetime, in which victims begged to be killed rather than endure another moment of the torture session at the hands of their psychopathic captors. After toast and a cup of coffee, I decided to drive back over to Rader's abandoned house in Park City. A beat-up wooden bench in his backyard was calling me. I'd spotted it 7 months earlier on my first visit to the property, perched amid an overgrown tangle of weeds and grass. I wanted to sit on it and have a nice long think. The streets and the highways of Wichita were empty, barren on that Monday morning. The place felt like a ghost town. From my hotel, the drive to Park City took less than 10 minutes. And on the way, I couldn't get last night's letter out of my mind. It had come from someone who would only identify himself or herself as close to Rader, although this could be anyone from Casarona to the handful of pen pals Dennis had attracted since his arrest. I wondered if it might be the same person who had contacted me months earlier with some inside information about Dennis. This time the source wanted to pass on some answers to me about Paula. Answers to the question I'd posed to Rader regarding what his wife would have known about his terrible, destructive appetite. And if this letter was correct, it turned out that Paula didn't know anything about her husband's being a killer, but she had seen something to upset and anger her about his sexual acting out. I also speculated that probably Rader himself was behind the letter. Perhaps he'd phoned the source after our prison meeting because a few of my questions had wormed their way into his thick head, and it concerned him that some people out there might still suspect that Paula had somehow covered up for him during those years he was on the lam. Then again, it could have been any of a number of people. A handful of folks knew I'd come to town this weekend in order to interview Rader. And from my conversations with his friends, police, and other sources, Rader had never stopped to consider the ramifications his murders would have on his family. According to Casarona, the couple had roughly $7,000 in savings at the time of Rader's arrest, leaving Paula with precious little to live off of when her husband was promptly sacked from his job a few days later. And judging from Rader's comments he made to me at El Dorado the morning before, the wake-up call about the mess he made of his wife's life came when Paula tried to sell the family's house in July 2005. The would-be buyer, who happened to be a well-intentioned, publicity-savvy owner of a popular strip club in the area, backed out of the deal upon learning that a civil lawsuit on behalf of the surviving family members of Rader's victims would block any of the cash from ever going to Paula. Now, the house I was driving towards sat in limbo, and Paula worked as a bookkeeper at a nearby Park City convenience store to make ends meet. So far, people have chosen to respect her privacy and leave her alone, including me. And ever since her husband's arrest, she spent most of her time living with her parents and said she had no interest in ever again stepping foot in the house where she and Dennis lived for over 30 years. Shortly before reaching Rader's house, I decided to take a short detour and stop by Rader's place of employment to see if there was anything I might have missed during my visit there with Landwehr months before. For 14 years, Rader's job in Park City's City Hall served as his refuge. The freedom his position granted him, not to mention the ego gratification, was one of the factors that kept Rader from killing with the frequency that he longed for. I think it would be safe to say that Rader's being a compliance officer might actually have saved a handful of lives in the community because the job allowed Rader's imagination plenty of room to breathe. Other than being incarcerated, there was perhaps no safer way for him to occupy his time for 8 hours each day, 5 days a week. The parking lot was empty when I arrived. Waves of heat radiated up from the vast expanse of black asphalt as though from a skillet. The only vehicles in the lot were two bone white Chevy pickup trucks in which Raider often tooled around the streets of Park City. I pulled up next to one of the trucks, rolled down the window of my car, and touched a tiny sticker over the rear quarter panel. It read Code Enforcement. Felt as though it had been cooked with a blowtorch. I pressed my hand against it and thought about how Raider used to crank up classical music on the stereo inside these vehicles and head off across the community, fantasizing about strangling people while talking dirty to the slick ad he'd brought with him and placed in the passenger seat. I rolled the window up and sat back in my car with the air conditioning on high, staring out through my windshield, reminding myself that this was the exact view Raider took in each day as he pulled in and out of this parking lot. In order to get to his office on the left side of the squat brick building, Raider had to walk across the parking lot and follow a little concrete sidewalk around the side of the structure. But seated there in the sweltering late morning heat, I realized something. On the far right side of the building, completely opposite to where Raider's office was located, sat the headquarters of Park City's 10-officer police force. As often as Raider, excuse me for a second. As often as Raider told himself that he loved his job as a compliance officer, deep down, he knew it was an ill-fitting substitute for what he truly yearned to be doing, working as a cop. Every morning, instead of heading to the right side of the building, to the police station, Raider was forced to follow the little sidewalk that stretched to the left to his job as dog catcher. It was just one more disappointment in a life filled with disappointments. The drive to Raider's house took only about 3 minutes. To get there, I drove past the city's tiny public library, located in a rundown mini mall where he'd often did much of his research for his final barrage of communiques to police. Raider's neighborhood felt like a cemetery. At this hour, the sun burned so hot overhead that nobody bothered watering their lawns. Hours would pass before the hoses and sprinklers were turned on. I parked, walked up Raider's cracked, crumbling concrete driveway, and noticed a sign in the plate glass window of his neighbor's house advertising piano lessons. Could this be the same neighbor mentioned in his journal? I wondered. The one he fantasized over as she clipped evergreen boughs from her shrubs to make a holiday wreath? There was nothing out of the ordinary about his place. It was roughly the same size of all his neighbors' homes, and besides having an overgrown yard, resembled every other residence on the street. People always seem surprised whenever I tell them how unremarkable the home of a killer can be. Of course, it's only human nature to want anything associated with a monster to stand out, much as everyone wanted Raider to resemble some sort of hideous ghoul with blood dripping from his teeth, someone who could be easily plucked out of a crowd. The problem is, they look like us and to some degree can act like us. The only time they don't occur. Okay, I'm going to read it just how it's written. The only time they don't occurs during those horrifying few moments when they morph into their true identity as a serial killer. But precious few people ever get a glimpse of that side of the killer's personality. And those who do seldom live long enough to tell anyone about it. I made my way to Raider's backyard and stood there in the middle of the brown dead grass, surveying the space that stretched off behind Raider's house. I've always felt that if you wanted to understand someone, all you need to do was spend some time in his backyard. It is there, hidden by the facade-like front of his home, that a person dares to act out all those things he keeps hidden away from the rest of the world. The yard was large and comfortable, roughly the area of 2 tennis courts laid side by side. Tall, leafy hickory trees bordered much of the perimeter of the yard, but in the center the sun had baked the ground into hard clay. When I spotted Raider's empty, battered aluminum storage shed, I poked around inside searching for something I figured I'd know when I saw it. But the shed had long since been picked over, no doubt by the police or someone looking to make a few bucks on eBay. I made a note to myself to check the website to see if any of his belongings turned up there. Raider kept his fishing gear back there in that shed, a source had told me, but it was gone now, except for a few hooks scattered on the floor, a couple of sinkers, and a tiny ball of knotted up nylon fishing line. Standing there, it occurred to me that this was perfect fishing weather, and I found myself wondering if Raider was standing at the window of his prison cell, looking out across the prairie, thinking this exact same thought. I recalled another story I'd heard from Caserona about Raider that happened on a day similar to this one. He was gazing out his cell window, daydreaming about God only knows what. He noticed a prison employee picking up trash in a stretch of grass near one of the many fences that encircled the facility. Raider's attention turned toward the man's slow, languid movements as he picked his way across the tough, wind-burned blades of grass. His head was fairly quiet. Raider wasn't thinking much about anything, but suddenly everything turned to shit, just the way everything did in his life. Because when the garbage man turned and spotted the familiar-looking visage of Dennis Raider staring at him through one of the prison's thick bullet-resistant windows, it was clear he didn't like what he saw one bit. In the time it took Raider to blink his eyes, the garbage man held up his middle finger, flipping Raider off, and this rubbed Raider the wrong way. Who the hell did that guy think he was? Raider heard himself think, That idiot is an employee of the state's Department of Corrections. His behavior certainly isn't the type of conduct taxpayers should tolerate. It's not only disrespectful, it no doubt violates some sort of rule of conduct for state employees. I'm ready to shut the fucking book. Are you aware of this man's delusion? Because a state employee recognized him and gave him the middle finger, Dennis Rader is incensed. And talk about how disrespectful this guy, and this no doubt violates some sort of rule of conduct for state employees. Well, you were a state employee running around murdering people. Bind, torture, kill, nigga. Bind, torture, kill. That's you. How dare you? So Raider turned away from his prairie vista and put out a call for a guard. And when the guard arrived at Raider's cell, Raider told him what had just transpired and how he didn't much appreciate being flipped off. The guard wrote up a report and disappeared. A few minutes later, Raider heard the cell block speaker system crackle to life. Whoever flipped off BTK, the voice intoned, needs to stop. He finds it disrespectful. Again, whoever flipped off BTK, please stop this disrespectful behavior at once. Raider smiled and shook his head. That ought to take care of that, he told himself. A split second later, the cell block exploded into a cacophony of laughter, jeers, and whistles. Before Raider knew it, he was laughing too. It was a peculiar image, I thought, because at first glance it almost appeared that Raider was laughing at himself. But he wasn't. This would have been impossible for an egomaniac like Raider. He would never have mentioned this incident to Caserona if he had understood that those other inmates were laughing at him. Instead, he interpreted the event as yet another example of how, for a brief instant, he'd become the center of the universe, the guy everybody was thinking and talking about. He was BTK, he told himself. Even in prison, he was the guy giving orders, and narcissistic sociopath that he was, he expected special treatment. I poked around the backyard a bit longer, kicking at the dirt and dead grass, checking out what remained of Raider's vegetable gardens, where he claimed to enjoy futzing about on summer evenings after work. His two black plastic compost bins were nearly covered over by vines and weeds. Of all the low-life psychopaths in whose lives I immersed myself, Raider had his role down pat. No wonder it took police so long to catch him. He could out-normal even the most normal person. If they gave out awards for alter egos, he'd be a contender for an Oscar. I tried to imagine Raider back here playing with his kids, pushing his daughter Carrie on the now rusted swing set, or sitting up on the now splintered planked floor of the treehouse with Brian. No matter how I attempted to picture a scene out of an idyllic Norman Rockwell painting, the images of Raider interacting with his family always lapsed into something hellish, terrifying, something resembling a canvas of Hieronymus Bosch. The vision caused me, to experience yet another deep pang of pity for Raider's wife and kids. What could compel a man to play charades like that with the three people who trusted him most? Oh, Lord. I think I need to take another break. How about one more song? What's a good song to play? I need to take another break. What's a good song? Um, um, let's see. Reaching across the call me tonight. Nah, I don't want to hear that one. But we say why? That is human nature. Why? Do it way? I need something long. What's a nice long song? What is a nice long song? Oh, okay. We'll do this one. Because I just need a break, reading like this for so long and so much. All right. Let's see. We must go on and present to you. I'm going to share the screen. We're going to do this and that. And I shall return,
Measure for measure, your love so much pleasure. say, you know I love me. You're the real that I feel never go away. You know I love me. Oh, you know that you do. You know I love me, baby. Oh, I know you do. Oh, see it, feel it. Don't you know your dream come true? Yeah. You know I love me. Oh, baby. Take this heart of mine. Love me, baby, all the time. Come on, give it to me, baby. You know how to love me, yeah. Ooh, I can feel it. I can feel it, baby. You know how to love me, yeah. Ooh, you know, 'cause you told me so. You know how to love me. There's no denying. You know how to love me. You know how to love me. You and I were meant to be. Meant to have the world can see that I love you, baby. Ooh, oh, baby. You know you love me, baby. You know I love me. So you do. You know how to love me. Oh, you know how to love me, baby. I can feel it. Got about it. You know how to love me. Oh, you know how to love me, baby. I love you, baby. And I need you, baby. You know that love me. I know, baby. You know how to love me. I wasn't born yesterday.
Okay. There's a few more pages left. Just a few more pages. All right, here we go. The rickety aluminum and wood bench sat out in the corner of the yard near the swing set, facing away from the house. I dropped down on it, feeling it nearly collapse beneath my weight, then closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the pulsing sounds of the locusts made in the hot, still air. Off in the distance to the west, I could see a bank of dark storm clouds forming. I thought back to that sweltering afternoon in August 2005 when millions of Americans glued themselves to their TV sets as BTK detailed his murders, listening to how calculated and planned each of his homicides were, hearing him discussing his crimes like a chef discussing a menu. It sickened me. Even with all my experience with guys like this, I've often wondered about the impact it must have had on regular folks. Standing there in that Sedgwick County courtroom in the suit he'd last worn to church, Rader became our nation's newest, darkest anti-celebrity. Tucked away in the front pocket of my shirt was a letter I'd found in my room last night. I rubbed my fingers over the fabric to make sure it was still there before pulling it out, unfolding it, and then spending the next few minutes reading over the 3 pages of text again. I wondered if Paula ever sat out here on those Saturday mornings when, I was told, Dennis used to shoo everybody out of the house so he could tidy the place up, leaving him alone to rummage through his stash of mementos from his kill. I wondered if this might have been where she went the first time she caught her husband hanging himself in drag. I tried to picture her out here, confused, hurt, wondering how the man who always told her he loved her could do such a thing. In her own way, Paula Rader performed a minor miracle. Although this is of no consolation to the families whose relatives her husband murdered, when Paula stumbled on Dennis hanging from the bathroom door, she inadvertently forced him to go into a type of low-grade hibernation. Outside of being arrested or killed, this was potentially the best thing that could have happened to Rader, preventing him from killing with even greater frequency. Who knows how many lives Paula may have saved? It was nearly 1 in the afternoon. I had a night flight to catch back to Dulles International that left from Kansas City, so I decided it was time to start my 4-hour drive to the airport. Walking back across Rader's yard, part of me wanted to put a match to his house to erase this ugly monument to the lie he lived for decades. I doubted any of his neighbors would care. But as interesting as I'd always found arson to be from a criminology standpoint, I hurried to my car, climbed inside, and cranked up the air conditioning. A few minutes later, I was speeding past Wichita, making my way back to the interstate that would take me to Kansas City. Fields of wheat and corn rushed past my window for nearly an hour before I noticed the message light flashing on my cell phone. I looked at the numbers and saw that Casarona had just called, so I retrieved the message. "I can't take this anymore," she moaned. "Last night I talked to Dennis. I swear to God, half the time I feel like I'm talking to a little boy, not the monster I know he is. You know what he tells me? He tells me that he's felt depressed all day and says, 'I know I have no room to say this, but I really miss McDonald's. I really miss their hamburgers and fries.'" I almost dropped my phone. Can you believe that? He killed 10 people and he feels bad that he can't have a cheeseburger and fries. What do you say to that? I wanted to throw up. I made myself stay calm. I felt like his mother or something. I said in this really patient voice, "Dennis, you really need to remember why you're in there. You need to remember that. He got all silent after that, and then he said, Yeah, I guess you're right. I can't take this anymore, John. Why did I ever write him that damn letter? I have no idea. Can you stand? Well, I have no idea how you can stand doing this. Casarona's voice faded away. I figured I must have hit a dead zone. I continued my trek east as my head churned through everything I'd absorbed over the past few days. 10 people were dead. Countless other lives had holes torn out of them, holes that would forever remain empty. All because of one man. For just over 3 decades, I've been trying to understand the man who calls himself BTK. I'd now spent the past year immersing myself in his world, interviewing the cops who tracked him, talking to his friends, reading his journals, poring over the words and images he left behind on paper. Here is what I had learned. What was his motive? Initially, Rader's motive for killing was simply to act out his bondage fantasies with a victim, then kill her. Nothing too complicated about that. But his reasons for killing began to evolve when he realized what effect his actions had on the men and women of Wichita. The adrenaline rush proved intoxicating. The community feared him. Overnight, he had gone from being a pathetic nobody to an all powerful puppet master. He pulled the strings and everybody danced. Before long, terrorizing the community and outwitting the police became as satisfying as acting out those dark fantasies on his victims. How did he pick his victims? What Rader really sought were women who were vulnerable. Nothing more. His victims could be any age. All that mattered was that he could bind and dress them exactly the way he wanted. Rader really didn't care what his victims looked like, because once he'd taken their lives, they became virtual entities existing only in his mind, where he could sexually assault them over and over again, embellishing all the details of the crime or their physical features in any way he wanted. How was he able to elude law enforcement for so long? Rader was a former criminal justice student and a police buff. He was an organized type of serial killer, meaning that he carefully thought about and planned each of his homicides. All of his victims, besides his neighbor, Maureen Hedge, were total strangers. For law enforcement, these so-called stranger homicides are the most difficult to solve. Something else he had going for him was patience. This is a quality not often found in other serial killers I've studied. He didn't murder with regularity. He could go years between killings because he was able to sustain his fantasies by taking personal items from his victims and then using them during his masturbation sessions while reliving his crimes. Why had Raiders resurfaced after all these years? Well, in January 2004, the Wichita Eagle ran a 30th anniversary story on the Otero homicides. The article chronicled the efforts of a local attorney who was in the process of writing a book about BTK. I learned that these two events worked together to flip a switch inside Rader's fragile ego. He'd be damned if someone else was going to pen a book about him when he was the only one who knew what his motivation was, what drove him into bondage, torture, and killing, what really happened during each of his homicides. So he decided to write his own book and eventually began sending messages to the media and police. In the end, his ego turned out to be his downfall. We in law enforcement should have used it against him much sooner. What made Dennis Rader a serial killer? It has always been my opinion that killers like Rader aren't born bad. From what I learned, Dennis wasn't physically tortured as a child. His ideas about bondage stemmed from an experience he had as a young boy, walking into his mother's bedroom and finding her entangled in her bed. The image lodged inside his head and festered. Several years later, he began tying up animals, drawing pictures of torture chambers, and sketching portraits of women bound in ropes and chains. Later in life, Rader began to devour detective magazines filled with stories about women being bound and tortured, along with true crime books. None of this material caused him to kill, but the material did fuel the pre existing fantasies that festered inside of his head. How can we prevent another BTK? It's much too late to stop the pain and horror caused by BTK. But understanding where we went wrong in our investigation is the best way to prevent another BTK from enjoying such a long reign of terror and carnage. To answer that question, you only have to start with that image of Rader's wife walking in on her husband hanging himself in full drag. Both times this happened, it scared the hell out of Dennis. Not enough to keep him from killing again, but enough to spook him. He feared that Paula would be able to connect the dots and gulp. Oh my God, my husband is BTK. But another part of him knew that he had little to worry about. Why? Because in those early years of the case, law enforcement agencies released precious little information about the unsub's probable behavior, traits, and characteristics. That was where I now believe we should have handled things differently. We knew from BTK's writings that at the very least, he was a police buff. More than likely, he was a wannabe cop. He described the scenes of his crimes as though he were a veteran member of CSI. I remember telling myself the first time I read his writings that in all probability, the unsub was a student of criminology. Knowing that Wichita State University offered such a program would have been a logical lead early on in the investigation. We also knew from the crime scenes that BTK was heavily into bondage, an interest that doesn't blossom overnight. Therefore, it seemed logical that BTK would possess a stash of pornographic material containing a fair share of bondage photos. His artistic ability was another trait that didn't just sprout one day. Of course, he was too far careful to sketch women wrapped in ropes and chains while he was watching the nightly news with his family. But surely someone had witnessed him drawing human figures, possibly even women. Perhaps it was something as simple as tracing a picture out of a magazine. Perhaps a family member had stumbled on a couple of Rader's drawings of women in bondage, strapped to some torture device or depictions of his crime scenes. Maybe that's what his son saw. Yet, because members of the community were unaware of all the specifics of Rader's crimes, they couldn't be expected to connect the dots even if they did find some of his drawings. That's one of the most important things I've learned regarding proactive police techniques. Once the leads begin to dry up, law enforcement departments need to begin releasing more information. It's crucial to get the community involved, to give people enough background into the case that they can better understand what drives the unsub, allowing them to become extra eyes and ears for law enforcement. Police also had examples of BTK's handwriting. and did, at one point, release a sample of the writing to the media. That Paula, who once noted the similarities between BTK's poor spelling and that of her husband, reportedly never saw this sample, tells me that this release should have been handled in a different manner. Several years ago, one of my former profilers working a triple homicide in the Tampa area came up with the idea of plastering a portion of a note written by the unsub on billboards in select parts of the city. Within 24 hours, someone recognized the handwriting, and the perp was arrested not long afterwards. I strongly believe that Rader's wife and children, his colleagues at work, his friends at Christ Lutheran Church, and other fathers in his Boy Scout troop could have recognized the behavioral characteristics of Dennis Rader had we released this information sooner in a systematic, controlled way. The problem was that in the 1970s and the 1980s, we were still learning. That sort of thing just wasn't done. Today, I believe we've accumulated the smarts and experience to nip a serial killer like Dennis Rader in the bud. Releasing this sort of information would have had a profound effect on Rader or any unsub that law enforcement would be attempting to identify in an ongoing investigation. Turning up the heat in this way would have created a tremendous amount of stress, causing Rader to become even more nervous and preoccupied with the case. Once that happened, he'd begin exhibiting behavior that those around him would probably have never witnessed before. This could include buying every available newspaper he could get his hands on, channel surfing the TV, and constantly switching between radio stations while listening for updates in the case. He might have begun either growing facial hair or shaving it off, losing weight or putting it on, drinking more than usual, becoming more prone to arguments, or experiencing difficulty falling asleep, then waking up in the middle of the night and listening to late night news. Perhaps he would have been looking for a legitimate reason to leave town for short periods, or his behavior might morph from appearing incredibly rigid and over controlled to seeming sloppy, careless, and disorganized. More than anything else, what the BTK case did was reinforce my belief that the authorities need to supply information to the general public the moment they've exhausted all logical leads. More often than not, this can occur within a few days or sometimes within a few hours of launching an investigation. The key here, however, isn't to release every bit of information known about the unsub, merely certain telling helpful bits. The rest should be held back, lest the authorities be inundated with false confessions from people looking for some sort of perverted notoriety. Those select bits and pieces of the crime analysis that are released, along with interviews with investigators and press releases, should be distributed in piecemeal fashion. If no credible leads develop, the information should be periodically re-released, along with flyers about the case, containing characteristics about the unsub. Monetary rewards are another good idea. They seem to work best when the informer can remain anonymous. The informer is given a code, which is nothing more than an identifying number or a word, when he or she supplies a possible lead or suspect name. Money will be paid if there is an indictment, which tends to be more effective than saying that payment will be based on a conviction. Because this approach is designed purely for its lead value, it doesn't require the informant to testify in court. Another incentive, as in most cases, the person being informed on is a family member, an associate from work, or a friend. Another strong tool for law enforcement is the media. Although I've been Although I've often been in the minority, I've always believed that the press can serve as a powerful ally of law enforcement. In many of the cases I worked on, I attempted to develop a strong bond with investigative reporters in the towns and cities where that particular crime had been perpetrated. Unfortunately, even decades later, there are still some police departments and other law enforcement agencies whose only comment to the media is no comment. Big mistake. The media, if properly managed, can be good friends to a criminal investigation. In the case of BTK, I believe police might have been more effective in their efforts to catch him if they played things a bit differently. Of course, back in the 1970s, that wasn't how things were done. Police kept a tight lid on case information, releasing it only when absolutely necessary. But now we know differently, and I'm convinced that if the authorities had taken a more proactive approach, disseminating very specific details about BTK to the public, someone who was acquainted with Rader might have recognized him and tipped off police that they knew of someone who seemed to fit the description of the man they were seeking. What sort of details would have allowed the public to make this connection? First, it would have been crucial to let the community know what sort of pre and post offense behavior someone like BTK would have exhibited. Second, his interest in detective magazines and bondage oriented porn and his gift of drawing people, particularly women, would have been a useful bit of information to release. Another useful data point that should have been shared with the public involved BTK's fascination with law enforcement and the likelihood that he might have attended Wichita State University. Finally, the likelihood that he practiced autoeroticism should have been circulated to the community. We now know that Paula caught her husband hanging himself on at least two occasions, but she was never quite clear on what he was actually doing and how it could have connected Dennis to the BTK murders. Paula Rader had been a loyal and loving wife, but if she had somehow received more detailed information about the behavioral traits of the unsub terrorizing her community, I believe she would have notified law enforcement, telling them everything she knew, even if she had done so anonymously. But that was then, and this is now. Since 1974, we've learned volumes from the Dennis Raiders of the world. There will always be violent offenders, but today law enforcement has a much better understanding of the motives and the minds of violent offenders. One of our greatest and most underused tools is the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP. What this computer analysis does is determine, for example, if two cases that occurred years apart and in different areas of the nation might have been perpetrated by the same offender. In 1985, I was present when French Smith, then the U.S. Attorney General, cut the ceremonial ribbon launching VICAP. Over 2 decades later, the program still depends on departments voluntarily submitting their unsolved cases for review and analysis. The fact that VICAP isn't a mandatory program not only saddens me, but sometimes keeps me awake at night. Our nation has more than 17,000 different law enforcement agencies operating within its borders. For whatever the reason, precious few communicate with each other or one another, nor do many feel compelled to share information. This needs to change, and fast. We desperately need a mandatory BTK program in this country. It won't eradicate serial violent offenders, but it will allow the authorities to intercept them much earlier in their criminal careers. Shafts of white sunlight shone down on the fields dotted with alfalfa rolled up in tractor-sized clumps resembling giant pieces of shredded wheat. The odor of skunk hung in the air. Warm blasts of highway wind slammed against my elbow as I drove with it jutting out the window. In the distance, that dark bank of clouds I'd first spotted hours earlier in Raider's backyard loomed closer. Their color reminded me of a deep, painful bruise. I was trying to put Dennis Rader far behind me, but couldn't. I was too tangled up inside my head, sifting through the past few days. It isn't wrong for us to be interested in heartless predators like Raider, I thought to myself. What is wrong and pathetic is the deep, powerful craving we have to get inside their skin. People often ask me why I want to write books about inhuman monsters like Dennis Rader. And my answer is always the same. I've always believed that by taking the sensationalism out of the crimes, I can destroy the myth. I described the gory details of their crimes, but never tried to sensationalize their actions. By recounting the story of the coward and loser that Raider and every other serial killer really is, I hope to cut the legend down to size. Most of all, I believe that by explaining how the mind of a serial killer works, I can begin to help readers understand how to avoid ending up as a victim of violent crime. Another hour had passed. I've been so lost inside my head that I hadn't noticed the sky. It had turned the darkest shade of black I'd ever seen. I pulled over to the side of the highway, realizing that everything around me was illuminated by a greenish glow. My heart began pounding. I killed the engine and climbed out of the car. Such stillness. The air felt dead. Nothing moved. I stared at the iridescent black sky above, trying to remember the last time I'd seen it go so dark in the middle of the afternoon. I climbed back into the car and switched on the radio. Further on down the road, I began to see jagged veins of lightning flashing, causing the radio to crackle. And according to a news report, flash floods had just torn through several nearby towns. And looking out the passenger window, I noticed the vague outline of tiny, shadowy funnels dangling beneath a ceiling of roiling clouds on the horizon. Tornado, I thought to myself. There was nothing to do but sit there and watch the shapes forming overhead. And from out of nowhere, a thought swirled inside my brain, and I found myself thinking about a dream Rada had recited to Caserona a few days before my arrival. The first portion was blurry in my memory, but what I remembered most was the tornado. It's no surprise to me that a sociopath, would be dreaming about a tornado. You have to understand. I said this before, but those of you who probably didn't listen to the past couple of reading sessions, when a tornado comes through a neighborhood, a town, prior to the tornado, You got businesses, gas stations, you know, Arby's. You have neighborhoods, nice houses and cars in the driveway and beautiful trees and landscaped yards and all that good stuff. And uh, electric poles, that give out electricity throughout the area. All this stuff, right? And a tornado comes through. And when you look at the TV, at the devastation, the news report that a tornado came through a town, and you can't even make out what was once a house. It's like the trees are now twigs that are sticking out of the ground. Houses have become looks like a pile of wood. You've seen the destruction. Well, psychopaths and sociopaths are the tornadoes of the human race. They come into your life, and when they leave, you are left devastated, just like a tornado that went through a town. You can be devastated mentally, emotionally, financially, and even physically. If you're lucky, perhaps you're just left maimed. It's better than death, right? The first portion was blurry in my memory, but what I remembered most was the tornado. According to Rader, a twister had just ripped through Wichita, and afterwards he found himself walking through the wreckage, picking his way through the debris strewn across the ground. Everywhere he looked, houses, cars, and trailers had been smashed into millions of tiny, splintered pieces, and every few feet he walked, he stopped to pick up a tattered photograph or what had once been a child's toy from the rubble. He held the torn, ripped bits of life in his fingers, inspecting each piece, wondering if any single image summed up the devastation Rader inflicted on the community of Wichita and on his own family. This was it. He was that dark, dirty, swirling twister, dropping out of the sky, destroying whatever he touched. The thought of it made me tired. I wish I could be done with Rader and put him behind me completely, although I knew that would never happen. He, and those like him, were my calling, like it or not. I'll be attempting to understand how their minds work for as long as blood and air flows through my body. The rain had come. It poured down in thick sheets. The highway was empty. I sat there on the side of the road thinking about nothing and everything at the same time. A tiny ribbon of blue sky and golden sunlight shimmered on the horizon, just below the curtain of black clouds. So I twisted the ignition, stomped on the accelerator, and drove like hell straight toward it, straight for the light. The end. Wasn't that a good book? It was really good. All right, so perhaps Monday I will be back on the other Madam with Bass channel to continue reading A Serial Killer's Daughter by Kerry Rawson. Kerry Rawson is the daughter of BTK. And yeah, I'm going to bed now. It's almost 2 a.m. Thank you, one person, for hanging out with me all through this evening. I did it all for you because you remained present and I didn't want to leave you hanging. So instead of waiting to read the final long ass chapter, I kept it up just for you. Whether you're one person or 1,000 people, you all are equally important to me. With all that being said, I bid you all a good night.